Montana Territory, January 1876. The wind howled across the frozen hills, a living thing with teeth of ice, and a voice that cut through the thickest wool. Snow spiraled upward like restless ghosts, and the sky hung low and heavy, pregnant with more to come. The temperature had fallen so drastically in the past hour that even the oldest residents of Dust Creek couldn't recall a January so bitter. Jackson Whitfield guided his horse carefully along the trail that led from town back to his ranch. The animal moved with uncertain steps, hooves breaking through the crust of snow. A sack of oats was secured to the saddle, the reason for his rare venture into town. The brim of his hat was crusted with ice, and his breath formed dense clouds before his face. He kept his head down against the wind, watching the ground more than what lay ahead. He'd been riding for nearly an hour, moving slowly through the worsening conditions, when something caught his eye, a flicker of movement near the small wooden church that sat alone on a hill at the edge of town. At first he thought it might be a branch torn loose by the wind. But as he drew closer, squinting through the swirling white, he saw it was not a branch at all. It was a woman. She lay crumpled on the church steps, barely visible beneath the drifting snow. Her dress, white and delicate, wholly unsuited to the weather, was spread around her like frozen wings. One arm was curled protectively around a small bundle pressed to her chest. Jackson pulled his horse to a stop. He was not a man who involved himself in the affairs of others. 7 years in this territory, and he'd kept to himself, speaking only when necessary, appearing in town only when supplies ran low. He had built his solitude with the same care with which he'd constructed his cabin, plank by plank, nail by nail, until it stood solid against the wind. Yet he found himself dismounting his boots, crunching in snow that reached halfway to his knees. As he approached, he saw her more clearly. Young, perhaps 20, with dark hair tumbling loose from what might have once been an elegant arrangement. Her skin was pale as the snow itself, her lips tinged blue. The bundle in her arms moved slightly, and Jackson froze. A baby. He crouched beside the woman, gently pulling back the thin shawl that covered the infant. The baby blinked up at him with unfocused eyes, its breath coming in rapid, shallow puffs, cheeks alarmingly red from the cold. It couldn't have been more than a few days old. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" The woman's eyes fluttered open, just barely a sliver of green between ice-crusted lashes. She looked at him without recognition, without fear, just exhaustion and something deeper, something old. "Please." Her voice was so faint he had to lean close to hear it. "Save her, Lily. Don't let her die in the snow." Her eyes drifted closed again. Jackson looked up at the church. Its windows were dark. The doors were shut tight against the storm. No help would come from there. His jaw tightened. He carefully gathered the woman and child into his arms. She was alarmingly light, as if the cold had hollowed her out. The baby didn't cry, just stared at him with wide, solemn eyes that seemed too knowing for something so new to the world. With a grunt of effort, he lifted them both onto his horse, positioning them in front of him. He pulled his heavy coat around them as best he could, then turned away from the church and back toward the trail that would lead to his ranch. Snow swirled around them, erasing their tracks almost as soon as they were made. Behind them, the church bell tolled once in the wind, cold and hollow. But Jackson didn't look back. He nudged his horse forward, and they moved slowly into the storm. Jackson's ranch sat at the base of Windbreak Ridge, tucked behind a stand of tall pines and a snow-drifted fence that leaned from years of wind. The house itself was small, hand-built from uneven planks, weathered to a silvery gray, the roof patched with old shingles and tar paper. A column of smoke curled from the stone chimney he had banked the fire before leaving that morning, knowing the weather was turning. He led his horse directly to the cabin door rather than to the barn the woman and child still held before him in the saddle. As he reached for the latch, a deep woof sounded from inside, followed by scratching at the door. "Down, Ranger!" he commanded. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the scent of pine smoke and leather. A large one-eyed dog, some mix of shepherd and wolfhound, rose from beside the hearth tail, wagging cautiously at the unfamiliar scents that had entered his domain. Jackson carried the woman to the narrow bed against the wall, laying her down with care he hadn't shown another human being in years. The cabin was simple, a table and 2 chairs, a small cook stove, shelves lined with canned goods and medical supplies, a desk in the corner piled with neat stacks of paper. Everything was orderly, well-maintained, but sparse. Nothing decorative, nothing unnecessary. The only hints of a life beyond mere survival were a small shelf of books and a wooden box on the mantel, its surface worn smooth from handling. Jackson removed the woman's snow-soaked shoes, then covered her with a heavy quilt. Ranger padded over, sniffing curiously at the bundle still clutched in her arms. "Easy," Jackson murmured gently, unwrapping the infant from the damp shawl. The baby girl blinked up at him, impossibly small and fragile. Her tiny fists were clenched tight, her face red from cold, but showing no signs of frostbite, protected by her mother's body to the very end. "You're quiet," he said softly, more to himself than to the child. "Good thing, too." He looked around the cabin, mentally cataloging what he had that might serve a baby. Not much. He'd need to improvise. With practiced efficiency, he kindled the fire to a roar, set water to heat, and gathered clean cloths from a chest. He found a small wooden crate that could serve as a makeshift cradle, lining it with soft flannel shirts. Once the water was warm, he cleaned the baby with gentle strokes, checking her for any signs of injury or illness. As he worked, he spoke to her in low, steady tones, the same voice he used with nervous horses. "Your mother's strong to have kept you alive in that cold. She'll pull through." It had been years since he'd treated anyone smaller than a calf, but his hands remembered. They moved with the sure, practiced motions of someone who had once done this every day. When he finished, he wrapped the baby in a clean shirt far too large, but warm and dry. Then he turned his attention to the mother. Her skin burned with fever, a stark contrast to how cold she had been outside. Not good. Her pulse was rapid, her breathing shallow. The contrasting heat and cold suggested infection, likely related to childbirth, given the newborn's age. Without treatment, sepsis could set in quickly. Jackson moved to his medical supplies. The wooden chest contained more than one might expect in a remote ranch house. Tinctures, powders, bandages, surgical instruments, all meticulously maintained. From a small bottle, he measured drops into a cup of water, then lifted the woman's head slightly. "This will help the fever," he said, though he doubted she could hear him. Some of the liquid trickled down her chin, but she swallowed reflexively. That was something, at least. He placed a cool cloth on her forehead, then checked the baby again, who had fallen asleep in her makeshift bed. Only then did Jackson notice the faint embroidered initials on the cuff of his shirt, SW. He quickly rolled the sleeve, hiding them from view. Ranger settled beside the crate, his one good eye fixed on the infant with surprising gentleness. Jackson nodded at the dog. "You watch her. I'll tend to her mother." Outside, the storm intensified, snow piling against the windows, wind moaning through the eaves. But inside, for the first time in 7 years, Jackson Whitfield was not alone with his silence. Abigail Winters awoke to unfamiliar shadows dancing across rough-hewn rafters. Her body felt impossibly heavy, her mouth dry as dust. For a long moment, She couldn't remember where she was or how she had gotten there. Then memory flooded back the church, the cold, the snow filling her wedding dress as she collapsed on the steps. Lily. She bolted upright, then fell back with a groan as pain shot through her body. My baby, she rasped, her voice barely audible. She's here. A man's voice, deep and steady. She's safe. Abigail turned her head to see a tall figure by the stove. The man was broad-shouldered, with dark hair streaked with gray at the temples, and a short beard that didn't quite hide the strong line of his jaw. His eyes were deep-set and watchful, the blue of a winter sky at dusk. Who? She struggled to form words through cracked lips. He approached, offering a cup of water. Drink first. Abigail drank greedily, the water soothing her parched throat. As her vision cleared, she looked around frantically. Where is she? Where's Lily? The man gestured to a wooden crate near the hearth. Sleeping. Has been for a few hours. Abigail tried to rise again, desperate to see her child. Easy. The man's hand was on her shoulder, gentle but firm. You've got a fever. Been out for nearly a day. A day. Panic surged through her. But I need to. Your baby's fine. Fed her some sugar water. Not ideal, but it'll do until you're well enough. He paused, studying her face. I'm no doctor, but I know milk fever when I see it. You're fighting an infection. Abigail relaxed slightly, though her eyes remained fixed on the crate. Please, can I see her? Without a word, the man retrieved the makeshift cradle and placed it beside the bed. Abigail peered in tears of relief welling as she saw Lily sleeping peacefully wrapped in what looked like a man's shirt. Thank you, she whispered, reaching out to touch her daughter's cheek. Thank you for saving us. The man nodded once, then returned to the stove where a pot simmered. You should eat something. Broth for now. Abigail watched him move around the cabin with economy of motion, nothing wasted. He seemed at home in silence. After a moment, she asked, Where am I? And who are you? He poured steaming broth into a bowl. My place, about 4 miles from town. He brought the bowl to her. Whitfield, just Whitfield. As he helped her sit up to eat, Abigail noticed a large dog watching them from across the room. Is he safe with the baby? A faint smile touched Whitfield's lips. Ranger, he's appointed himself guardian. Won't leave her side. True enough, as soon as Abigail finished eating and lay back down, the dog returned to his position by the cradle head on his paws, but eyes alert. Why were you at the church? Whitfield asked, taking the empty bowl. In a wedding dress. With a newborn. The bluntness of the question startled her, but there was no judgment in his tone, just simple curiosity. Abigail closed her eyes, the humiliation of that morning washing over her anew. I was supposed to be married yesterday. To Marcus Powell. Judge Powell's son. She nodded, not surprised he knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew the Powells. He promised we'd marry once he knew I was with child. Said we'd start a new life. Her voice cracked. But he didn't come. His mother found me waiting and said Lily wasn't his, that I was trying to trap her son with another man's child. She couldn't bring herself to repeat the cruel words Mrs. Powell had used. How they'd called Lily a bastard, how they'd shoved her out into the snow. They threw us out. No one helped. I tried to make it to the boarding house, but the snow, I couldn't. She trailed off the memory of that desperate walk through blinding white, still too raw. Whitfield was silent for a long moment. Then he said simply, Rest now. You're safe here. Both of you. As he turned away, Abigail noticed something odd. The cuff of his shirt, where it had rolled back slightly, revealed embroidered initials SW, not matching his name. Before she could ask, exhaustion claimed her again, and she drifted back to sleep. A pounding at the door jolted Jackson awake. He'd been dozing in the chair beside the bed, one hand on his rifle. Ranger was already on his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The woman Abigail stirred but didn't wake. The baby had been fed again just an hour ago and was sleeping soundly. The pounding came again, more insistent. "Whitfield, open up. I know you're in there." Jackson recognized the voice immediately. Judge Harold Powell. He checked that his guests were covered, then moved to the door, rifle still in hand. "Quiet," he said as he unlatched the door. "I've got people sleeping." The door swung open to reveal Judge Powell standing on the porch, snow swirling around his imposing figure. Behind him were two men Jackson recognized as the Powell ranch hands, both wearing sidearms despite the weather. "People, is it?" Powell's voice dripped with disdain. His eyes, sharp as flint, took in the cabin's interior. "I heard you picked up something that doesn't belong to you, Whitfield." Jackson didn't move from the doorway. "Don't know what you mean, Judge." "Don't play stupid with me. Walter Cooper was riding back to town and saw you take that Abbott girl from the church steps." "Winters?" Jackson corrected. "Her name is Abigail Winters." Powell waved a hand dismissively. "Whatever she calls herself, she's my son's intended, and she needs to come with us. Her condition requires proper care. Her condition requires rest. The fever hasn't broken. Moving her now could kill her and the child." The judge's face hardened. "That's not your concern. The girl is confused, distraught. My son told me about her problems, how she spent time in an asylum back east." From behind Jackson came a weak voice. "What did you say?" He turned to see Abigail struggling to sit up, her face pale with shock. "What asylum?" she asked, her voice stronger, now edged with anger. "What lies has Marcus told you?" The judge looked past Jackson to address her directly. "Now, Abigail, there's no shame in it. Mental fragility runs in some families. Marcus explained everything, how you fabricated this engagement when he was only trying to help you." "Fabricated?" Abigail's laugh was bitter. "I have letters, promises. Your son left me at the altar with his child." Powell's expression darkened. "You're a confused young woman from a questionable background. Who would believe you over the son of a territorial judge?" Jackson had heard enough. He stepped fully into the doorway, blocking Powell's view of Abigail. "The storm's not letting up until morning, Judge. No one's traveling tonight. You can come back tomorrow when it's safer." "You're making a mistake, Whitfield," Powell warned. "You're a man with secrets of your own, aren't you? Might be a shame if those came to light." Jackson's face remained impassive, but his grip tightened on the rifle. "Good night, Judge." He shut the door before Powell could respond, sliding the heavy wooden bolt into place. Through the window he watched the three men retreat to their horses, the judge casting one last glance at the cabin before they disappeared into the swirling snow. "What did he mean?" Abigail asked, her voice small in the renewed quiet. "About an asylum." Jackson returned to the fire, stoking it higher against the deepening cold. "People will say anything to protect what they think is theirs." "I've never been in an asylum," she insisted. "I grew up in an orphanage in Boston, St. Mary's Home for Girls. I never even left Massachusetts until Marcus—" She faltered, then continued with determination. "He's lying. They're all lying." "I believe you," Jackson said simply, and was surprised to find that he meant it. Abigail settled back, her strength clearly spent. The baby began to fuss, and Jackson lifted her carefully from the crate, bringing her to Abigail. "She needs feeding," he said, turning away to give them privacy. As Abigail nursed Lily, she studied the man who had saved them. There was something in the set of his shoulders, the precision of his movements that spoke of a life far different from that of a solitary rancher. And those initials on his shirt, SW, not JW. "Mr. Whitfield," she said hesitantly, "why did you help us? You could have ridden past. Many did." Jackson remained with his back to her, organizing his medical supplies with methodical care. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. "You looked like someone I used to know," he finally said so quietly she almost didn't hear him. Before she could ask more, Lily finished nursing and began to cry, a thin, reedy sound that echoed in the cabin. Abigail tried to soothe her, but her own exhaustion made it difficult. Jackson approached, holding out his hands. "May I?" Surprised, Abigail nodded. He took Lily with unexpected gentleness, cradling her against his broad chest. He began to pace slowly around the cabin, speaking to the infant in a low, steady voice. "You've had quite a day, little one. Quite a day indeed. But you're safe now. You and your mother both." To Abigail's amazement, Lily quieted almost immediately, her cries fading to soft hiccups, then silence. "How did you do that?" she asked. Jackson shrugged slightly. "Babies are like colts. They sense fear. Stay calm, they stay calm." As he continued to walk with Lily, Abigail's eyes grew heavy. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her again was the silhouette of this quiet, mysterious man holding her daughter. His profile illuminated by firelight, his shadow stretching long across the cabin floor. And in that moment, despite everything, she felt safer than she had in months. The fever worsened in the night. Jackson sat beside Abigail's bed, replacing cool cloths on her forehead as she tossed restlessly, muttering words he couldn't understand. Occasionally, a name would break through clearly: Mother, Marcus, and once, with particular anguish, Sarah. At that name, Jackson froze, the cloth suspended above her brow. He glanced toward the mantel where the wooden box sat untouched since the strangers had arrived. Lily began to cry again, a more insistent wail this time. Jackson checked that Abigail was secure, then retrieved the baby. She'd been fed before Abigail succumbed to delirium, so it wasn't hunger. He checked her wrappings dry. Perhaps she simply sensed her mother's distress. "Hush now," he murmured, but the infant's cries only intensified. Jackson considered his options. The cabin was warm, but the baby's screams might further disturb Abigail's rest. Outside, the storm had temporarily abated, though snow still fell steadily. Decision made, he wrapped Lily in an extra blanket, pulled on his coat, and stepped onto the porch. The night air was crystalline, and still snow falling in fat, lazy flakes that glittered in the moonlight. The temperature had risen slightly, still well below freezing, but no longer the bone-cracking cold of earlier. He walked to the barn, speaking softly to Lily all the while. Inside, his horse whickered in greeting, and the warmth of the animals created a pocket of comfort against the winter night. Jackson settled on a bale of hay, rocking Lily gently. "Your mother's strong," he told her. "Fighting hard. You've got her spirit, I can tell." Lily's cries gradually subsided, her eyes fixing on Jackson's face with that same solemn gaze. "You're a serious one, aren't you?" he said, allowing himself a small smile. "Well, I suppose you've had a serious start to life." He found himself continuing to talk, the words coming more easily in the darkness of the barn, with only a newborn and drowsing animals to hear. "My wife used to say babies need to hear voices, that they learn the world through words before they understand their meaning." He swallowed hard. She was usually right about such things. Lily made a small sound, not quite a coo, and Jackson's smile deepened slightly. "Thought you might agree." From the cabin came the sound of coughing. Jackson stood immediately, cradling Lily close as he hurried back through the snow. Inside, he found Abigail sitting up, her face flushed with fever, eyes wild and unfocused. "Fire!" she gasped. "I smell fire." "There's no fire," Jackson assured her, setting Lily in her crate before moving to Abigail's side. "Just the hearth. You're safe." But Abigail was caught in some fever dream, her hands clawing at the quilt. "Mother, please, don't leave me." Jackson gently restrained her wrists. "Abigail, you're at my ranch. Your daughter is safe. You need to rest." At the mention of Lily, some clarity returned to her eyes. "My baby. Right there," Jackson said, nodding toward the crate. "Sleeping now." Abigail relaxed marginally, then looked at him with a strange intensity. "You're not him. Not Marcus. No, I'm Whitfield. Sarah's husband." Abigail murmured, her eyes drifting closed again. "Sarah's lost husband." Jackson stiffened. "What did you say?" But Abigail had slipped back into restless sleep, leaving Jackson to wonder if he had misheard, or if in her delirium she had somehow glimpsed a truth no one in Dust Creek was supposed to know. The storm passed, with the night leaving behind a world transformed. Every surface was smoothed and softened by snow, the morning sun turning the landscape into a sea of blinding white. Inside the cabin, a different kind of transformation was underway. Abigail's fever broke just before dawn. Jackson, who had kept vigil through the night, felt her forehead and found it cool and damp. Her breathing had steadied her pulse stronger. She would live. Relief washed through him stronger than expected for a woman who was, by all accounts, a stranger. He had seen too much death in his life. Each life saved felt like a small atonement for those he couldn't save. When Abigail finally opened her eyes, truly awake, for the first time in days, she found Jackson at his desk, writing in what appeared to be a journal. Lily was in his lap, contentedly gumming the edge of his shirt collar. "You're good with her," Abigail said, her voice raspy from disuse. Jackson looked up, surprised. He hadn't heard her wake. "She's an easy baby." "No such thing," Abigail said with a weak smile. "Especially not at that age." She tried to sit up, grimacing at the stiffness in her body. Jackson set down his pen and brought Lily to her. "Hungry?" Abigail nodded, taking her daughter gratefully. "How long was I?" "3 days, give or take. Fever broke this morning." "3 days?" Abigail looked down at Lily in amazement. "You've been caring for her all this time." Jackson shrugged, moving to the stove. "She mostly sleeps. Cries when she's hungry or wet. Not complicated." "Still, thank you." Abigail adjusted her position to feed Lily, then looked around the cabin with clearer eyes. "This is your home, just you, just me, and Ranger." As if summoned, the dog trotted over, tail wagging cautiously as he sniffed at Abigail's blanket. "He's taken with your daughter," Jackson said, setting a bowl of what smelled like venison stew beside her. "Hardly leaves her side." Abigail reached out tentatively to pat the dog's head. Ranger leaned into her touch, his one eye closing in contentment. "What happened to his eye?" she asked. "Wolf attack, 3 years back." Jackson sat in the chair near the bed. He held off a whole pack that was after the sheep. "Lost the eye, saved the flock." The simple pride in his voice told Abigail more about the man than perhaps he intended. Whatever secrets Jackson Whitfield kept, cruelty wasn't among them. "Mr. Whitfield," she began carefully, "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done, but I can't impose on you any longer. Once I'm strong enough, Lily and I should go." Go where? His question was blunt but not unkind. Abigail faltered. I'm not sure. I had a room at the boarding house in town, but that was arranged by Marcus. I doubt Mrs. Thorne would welcome me now. Judge Powell made it clear what would happen if you returned to town, Jackson reminded her. At least until things cooled down. Now then I'll go to Helena or Fort Benton. I have a little money saved. I could find work. Jackson's expression remained neutral. With a newborn in winter. He shook his head. Spring's a better time for new beginnings. Stay until then. Abigail studied him, trying to understand his motives. Men in her limited experience always wanted something. Why would you do that? You don't know me. Jackson rose, moving to the window where the morning light streamed in. For a long moment he was silent, his profile sharp against the brightness outside. I've lived alone a long time, he finally said. Sometimes a man forgets what it means to be human. He turned back to her. You need a safe place. I have one. Simple as that. There was something in his eyes, a flash of old pain quickly masked, that made Abigail believe him. Perhaps they were both running from something. Perhaps for a little while they could stop running together. Until spring, then, she agreed softly. If you're certain. Jackson nodded once, then retrieved his coat from a peg by the door. Need to check the stock. Rest. Food's on the stove if you want more. After he left, Abigail finished feeding Lily, then carefully laid her in the wooden crate. The baby's eyes drifted closed almost immediately. Ranger settled beside the makeshift cradle, his watchful presence reassuring. Abigail's gaze fell on Jackson's desk, where the journal lay open. She knew she shouldn't look. Privacy was a rare commodity in a space this small. But something drew her to the neat handwriting that filled the page. January 18th, 1876. Sarah, it's been 7 years today. 7 years since I lost you and Rebecca. The snow fell just like this the day they told me you were gone. Sometimes I think I hear your voice in the wind. Abigail stepped back, her hand covering her mouth. She shouldn't have read even that much. This was a private grief not meant for her eyes. She returned to the bed, the name echoing in her mind. Sarah, the same name she had apparently spoken in her fever dreams. Who was Sarah, his wife? And Rebecca, a daughter, perhaps. Both gone, it seemed. No wonder Jackson lived alone, kept to himself. He was a man hollowed by loss. Outside, the sun reflected blindingly off the snow. In the distance, Abigail could see Jackson moving between the barn and the small sheep pen, his figure dark against the whiteness. A solitary man carved by grief into something hard and enduring. Like her, a survivor. But of what exactly she still didn't know. Days passed and a fragile routine emerged. Abigail's strength returned gradually. She began helping with simple tasks, washing dishes, mending torn shirts, rocking Lily when she fussed. Jackson continued to care for his small flock of sheep and 2 horses, disappearing for hours during the day to check fence lines and clear paths through the deepening snow. They spoke little, but the silence between them grew comfortable rather than strained. Jackson showed no sign of regretting his offer of shelter, and Abigail was careful to earn her keep. She discovered he was a surprisingly good cook, though his meals were plain and practical. In turn, she showed him how to make biscuits the way they did at the orphanage, light and flaky, despite the basic ingredients. One evening, as they sat by the fire after Lily had been fed and settled, Abigail found the courage to ask about the journal. I saw a name, she admitted. When you left it open. Sarah. She twisted her hands in her lap. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have looked. Jackson was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled. My wife. She died 7 years ago. I'm sorry, Abigail said, again, meaning it. Was there— You mentioned a Rebecca, our daughter. His hands tightened on the arms of his chair. She was 4. Abigail's heart ached for him. What happened, if you don't mind me asking? Jackson stood abruptly, moving to the mantel where the wooden box sat. For a moment, his hand hovered over it, as if he might open it. Instead, he turned back to her. Fire, he said simply, while I was away. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken grief. Abigail remembered her fever dream, the smell of smoke, the panic. Had she somehow sensed his loss? That's why you live out here alone, she asked softly. Partly. He returned to his seat, his posture rigid. What about you? You said you grew up in an orphanage? Abigail accepted the change of subject. Yes, St. Mary's in Boston. I never knew my parents. I was left there as an infant with just a name, Abigail, pinned to my blanket. She smiled sadly. And this? She reached into the pocket of her borrowed dress and pulled out a small, worn handkerchief. It was faded white linen with the initials SW embroidered in the corner in faded blue thread. It's the only thing I have from before. I don't know who SW was. A father, maybe. Or a mother, Sarah, perhaps. She glanced up at Jackson. Like your wife. Jackson had gone very still, his eyes fixed on the handkerchief. May I? He asked, his voice strangely constrained. Abigail handed it to him, watching as he examined it with a care that seemed excessive for such a simple item. The orphanage had no record of who left me, she continued. Just that I was found on their doorstep one winter morning. I used to imagine my mother was a duchess who had to hide me away from enemies. She laughed softly at the childish fantasy. More likely she was a servant girl who couldn't feed another mouth. Jackson returned the handkerchief, his expression unreadable. How did you end up in Montana Territory? Marcus. He came to Boston on business last spring. He was charming. Said he was looking for a bride who wasn't afraid of frontier life. She twisted the handkerchief between her fingers. When I realized I was with child, he promised we'd marry before anyone knew. Said he'd send for me, and he did. But instead of a wedding, you got Judge Powell and a church full of accusing faces, Jackson finished. Abigail nodded, blinking back tears. I truly believed he loved me. I thought Lily would have a father, a proper home. She looked up at Jackson, a flicker of her inner strength showing through. I won't make that mistake again. Trusting too easily. Trust has to be earned, Jackson agreed. But don't let one man's betrayal harden you completely. There's a middle ground between naive trust and bitter suspicion. Is that where you live? In that middle ground? The question seemed to surprise him. No, he admitted after a moment. I've been firmly on the bitter side for too long. Before Abigail could respond, Lily began to cry. She moved to get up, but Jackson was already on his feet. I'll bring her to you. As he lifted Lily from her crate, his movements now practiced and confident, Abigail was struck by how quickly this stern, solitary man had adapted to having an infant in his home. She wondered if he was thinking of his own daughter, the one he'd lost. If caring for Lily was a kind of healing for him, as much as his care had been healing for them. When he placed Lily in her arms, their hands brushed. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through Abigail, and she found herself looking up into Jackson's eyes. For once they weren't guarded or distant. Instead, she saw something that mirrored her own fragile hope, that perhaps amid this harsh winter they had both found a safe harbor, however temporary. The moment passed quickly. Jackson stepped back, resuming his seat by the fire. But something had changed in the air between them, a recognition of shared wounds of possibilities neither had dared consider before. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and silent against the windows. Inside, two broken people and one new life settled into the quiet of a winter evening, the fire crackling with promises neither was ready to name. Abigail learned about Jackson Whitfield in fragments, like pieces of ice breaking free during a spring thaw. He never volunteered information about himself, but occasionally, in response to her questions, he would offer a small glimpse into his past. He had been in Montana Territory for 7 years. Before that, he had lived back east, though he never specified where. He knew a surprising amount about medicine herbs setting bones. He read voraciously. His small shelf of books was well worn, the pages dog-eared and marked with notes in the margins. And every evening after Abigail and Lily were asleep, or when he thought they were, he would take out the wooden box from the mantel, write in his journal, and sometimes hold something in his palm, something that caught the firelight like metal. One morning, as January gave way to February, Abigail was sweeping the cabin floor when her broom dislodged a loose floorboard near the hearth. Beneath it she glimpsed what looked like paper. Curious, she knelt and carefully pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline made her breath catch. Tragedy at Shiloh Army Surgeon's family perishes in fire. Below was a grainy photograph of a military hospital tent, and standing in front of it, a younger version of Jackson in a Union Army uniform. Except the caption beneath read, Dr. Samuel Whitfield Center with the 16th Illinois Medical Corps. Samuel Whitfield. S.W. Abigail's hand trembled as she read the brief article. While Dr. Whitfield performed heroic service saving wounded soldiers, a tragic fire claimed the lives of his wife Sarah and daughter Rebecca at their home in Cairo, Illinois. The date on the newspaper was April 1862, 14 years ago, not 7, and the initials on her handkerchief, S.W., matched the man in the photograph. Was it possible? Could Jackson Whitfield actually be this doctor's Samuel Whitfield? But if so, why the deception? Why claim his family died 7 years ago instead of 14? And why change his name? The sound of boots on the porch sent Abigail scrambling to replace the newspaper and floorboard. By the time Jackson entered, she was back at her, sweeping, her heart racing. "Storm's coming," he announced, stomping snow from his boots. "Big one. Animals are restless." Abigail nodded, struggling to keep her expression neutral. "I'll make sure we have extra water drawn." Jackson gave her an odd look. "You feeling all right? You're flushed." "Just warm from the fire," she lied, turning away. That night, as a howling blizzard engulfed the cabin, Abigail lay awake, the discovery weighing on her mind. The man who had saved her life, who had cared for her daughter with such gentleness, was living under a false name. What other secrets did Jackson or Samuel harbor? And more unsettling still, why did the initials on her only connection to her unknown past match the name of the man who had found her in the snow? Coincidence seemed too simple an answer. But the alternative, that there was some connection between them beyond their chance meeting at the church steps, seemed impossible. In the darkness, Lily stirred and whimpered. Abigail reached for her, drawing the infant close to her chest. "What do we do, little one?" she whispered. "Do we ask him, or do we keep his secret, as he's kept ours?" Across the room, Jackson shifted in his sleep, murmuring something indistinct. The wind screamed around the eaves like a woman in pain, and Abigail pulled the blankets higher, trying to shut out both the cold and the questions that had no answers. For now, at least, they were safe. The rest would have to wait for morning's light. The storm lasted 3 days, confining them to the cabin. During that time, Abigail watched Jackson with new awareness, searching for signs of the man in the newspaper photograph. They were there if one knew to look the precise way he splinted a broken chair leg, the careful measurements of herbs for tea when Lily had colic, the military straightness of his posture even when at ease. But most telling was the sorrow that sometimes claimed his features when he thought no one was watching. It was not the grief of 7 years still raw and bleeding. It was older, deeper worn smooth by time like a river stone, the grief of 14 years carried alone. On the third evening, as the storm finally began to abate, Jackson surprised her by taking his rifle from its place above the door. "You should know how to use this," he said, checking that it was unloaded before offering it to her. Abigail hesitated. "I've never fired a gun." "That's why you need to learn." His tone brooked no argument. "The world doesn't care about your pain, Abigail. It doesn't make allowances for what you've lost. All that matters is whether you can protect what you have left." The intensity in his voice suggested he was speaking from bitter experience. Abigail took the rifle, finding it heavier than expected. "Like this," Jackson said, adjusting her grip. "Butt against your shoulder firm, but not tight. When you're ready to fire, breathe out slowly, then squeeze. Don't pull the trigger." His hands were warm and sure as they positioned hers, his chest briefly pressing against her back as he demonstrated the proper stance. Abigail felt a rush of heat that had nothing to do with the fire. "When the storm clears," he continued, stepping back, "we'll practice with bottles on the fence. Every day until you can hit what you aim at." "Do you expect me to need this skill soon?" she asked, trying for lightness but hearing the tension in her voice. Jackson took the rifle back, his eyes serious. "I expect you to be ready for whatever comes. Judge Powell isn't a man who forgets a slight, and you've dealt his family pride a blow by refusing to play the role he assigned you. I just want to be left in peace to raise my daughter." "Peace has to be earned out here," Jackson said, returning the rifle to its hooks. "Sometimes with lead." The starkness of his statement hung in the air between them. Abigail thought of the article of the doctor who had saved soldiers' lives while his own family perished. What had happened to transform that man of healing into this hard-eyed rancher who spoke of guns as necessities? "Mr. Whitfield," she began carefully, "the day we met you said I reminded you of someone. Was it your wife?" She saw his shoulders tense, saw the way his hands stilled in the act of securing the rifle. "Not your face," he said finally, his back still to her. "The way you held Lily, like she was the last thing that mattered in the world." He turned his eyes, meeting hers with unexpected directness. "Sarah used to hold Rebecca that way, like nothing. Not fire, not flood, not the devil himself could make her let go." The raw honesty in his voice stripped away Abigail's resolve to confront him about the newspaper. Whatever his reasons for the deception, they were deeply personal, carved from the same grief that had made him stop on a snowy night to save a woman and child who reminded him of what he'd lost. "Thank you," she said softly, "for teaching me, for everything." Jackson nodded once, the vulnerability in his eyes already receding behind his usual reserve. "Dawn comes early. We should sleep." But that night, as Abigail drifted into dreams, it wasn't the mystery of Jackson Whitfield that occupied her thoughts. It was the warmth of his hands on hers, the solid presence of him behind her, and the realization that for the first time since arriving in Montana, she didn't feel utterly alone. And that, perhaps, was the most dangerous discovery of all. The days that followed brought a temporary thaw, turning the packed snow to treacherous slush during daylight hours before freezing again at night. Jackson took advantage of the milder weather to repair fences damaged by the storms. Abigail, now fully recovered, took over the household tasks and care of Lily, who was growing visibly stronger each day. True to his word, Jackson began teaching Abigail to shoot. They used empty bottles lined along the fence as targets, and though her first attempts sent shots wild into the snow, she improved quickly under his patient instruction. "You have a steady hand," he commented after she hit 3 bottles in succession. "Good eye, too." Abigail lowered the rifle, pleased with the rare praise. "I used to thread the smallest needles at the orphanage. The nuns said I had preternatural patience. I think they just wanted me to do all the fine stitching." But Jackson almost smiled, a slight softening at the corners of his mouth that Abigail had come to recognize as his version of amusement. "Patience serves a shooter well," he said, setting up fresh targets. "Most people rush. They want the bang and the break, the immediate result. But the best shots are the ones who can wait, who understand that the moment between breaths is where accuracy lives." There was poetry in his words that surprised her, a glimpse of the educated man beneath the frontier exterior. It made Abigail wonder again about his past, about what had driven a doctor to abandon his profession and his name. As February progressed, they settled into a companionable routine. Abigail cooked and kept the cabin learning to adapt her limited culinary skills to the staples Jackson had stored for winter. Jackson tended the animals hunted when weather permitted and continued to show a remarkable affinity for calming Lily when she was fussy. One evening, he returned from checking the sheep to find Abigail at his desk writing in a small notebook she'd found among his supplies. "I hope you don't mind," she said, looking up. "I wanted to start a journal for Lily, so she'll know about her beginnings. The truth, not what others might tell her." Jackson set down his rifle and removed his snow-crusted coat. "Good idea. A child should know where they come from." "Even if it's painful?" Abigail asked, thinking of how she would explain Marcus's abandonment when Lily was old enough to understand. "Especially then." Jackson sat heavily in his chair by the fire. "Better a painful truth than a comfortable lie. The truth gives you solid ground to stand on, no matter how rocky. Lies are quicksand. They might feel safer at first, but they'll swallow you eventually." The irony of this statement coming from a man living under a false name wasn't lost on Abigail. Yet she sensed he wasn't being hypocritical, that whatever reasons he had for becoming Jackson instead of Samuel, they weren't rooted in deception, but in some deeper pain. "What will you tell her about her father?" Jackson asked, nodding toward Lily, who was exploring the texture of a wool blanket with intense concentration. Abigail sighed. "That he wasn't ready to be a father. That it wasn't her fault." She looked up at Jackson. "That sometimes people leave, and it has nothing to do with whether you deserve to be loved." The words hung in the air between them, resonating with a shared understanding of abandonment, hers, recent and raw, his buried under years of solitude. "And what about you?" Jackson asked, his voice unusually gentle. "What will you tell her about yourself? That I loved her from the moment I knew she existed. That I would do anything to keep her safe." Abigail smiled softly at her daughter. "That we had a rough start, but we found our way." Jackson nodded, his gaze moving from Lily to Abigail. "She's lucky to have you." "We're both lucky," Abigail said, meeting his eyes, "to have found you." Something shifted in Jackson's expression, a momentary softening, a flash of vulnerability quickly masked. He stood abruptly. "Need to check the horses before full dark," he muttered, reaching for his coat again. But, as he passed Abigail, his hand briefly, almost hesitantly, touched her shoulder, a gesture so gentle it might have been imagined. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. Abigail sat very still, her heart beating faster than it should. She was acutely aware of the warmth that lingered where his fingers had rested, the way her body had instinctively leaned toward his touch. "Oh, Lily," she whispered, looking at her innocent daughter, "I think we might be in trouble." Because despite all her promises to never trust easily again, despite the mystery surrounding Jackson Whitfield's true identity, Abigail was starting to feel something dangerous, something that felt remarkably like hope. And hope, in her experience, was the most treacherous emotion of all. February gave way to March, bringing longer days and a tentative warmth that loosened winter's grip on the land. The snow began to retreat, revealing patches of muddy earth and the first brave shoots of spring grass. Inside Jackson's cabin, a different kind of thaw was underway, slower, more cautious, but no less profound. Abigail had grown stronger with each passing day. The frail woman Jackson had found dying in the snow was gone, replaced by someone with clear eyes and a determined set to her jaw. She moved through the cabin with growing confidence, her hands constantly busy with cooking, cleaning, mending. Lily, too, flourished under their shared care, her newborn fragility giving way to chubby cheeks and a surprisingly strong grip when she caught hold of Jackson's finger. They had developed an unspoken rhythm, moving around each other in the small space with the ease of dancers who had practiced their steps. In the mornings, Jackson would rise first, build up the fire, and put coffee on to boil. By the time Abigail awoke, he'd have already been to the barn to tend the animals. They'd share a simple breakfast, then Jackson would head out to his daily tasks while Abigail cared for Lily and the cabin. In the evenings, they'd eat together, talking little but comfortably. Sometimes Jackson would read aloud from one of his books, histories mostly, or practical guides to farming and animal husbandry. Occasionally, something more surprising, poetry by Wordsworth or Longfellow passages, read in a low, steady voice that revealed an education at odds with his rough exterior. It was during one such evening, with March winds howling outside and the cabin warm with lamplight, that a knock came at the door. Jackson set down his book, immediately alert. His hand moved toward the rifle before he caught himself. "Expecting anyone?" he asked Abigail, though they both knew the answer. She shook her head, drawing Lily closer to her chest. No one had visited since Judge Powell's confrontation more than a month ago. They'd been left to their isolation, either forgotten or deliberately ignored by the residents of Dust Creek. The knock came again, more insistent. Ranger growled low in his throat. "Stay back," Jackson said, moving to the door with the quiet efficiency that characterized all his movements. He unlatched it carefully, keeping his body positioned to shield Abigail and Lily from whatever waited outside. On the porch stood a stout older woman, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, a basket covered with a cloth in her hands. Despite the cold, she wore only a woolen shawl over her dress, as if she hadn't planned to be out long. "Martha Colson," she announced without preamble. "Live over the ridge, brought pie." She thrust the basket forward, steam rising from beneath the cloth. "Peach, preserves from last summer." Jackson hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "Mrs. Colson, going to invite me in, or do I freeze on your doorstep?" the woman asked, one eyebrow raised. After a moment's consideration, Jackson stepped aside. Martha Colson entered the cabin with the confidence of someone accustomed to making herself at home wherever she went. Her sharp eyes took in everything: the cradle near the fire, Abigail seated with Lily, the general order of the household. "So it's true," she said, setting her basket on the table. "Walter Cooper isn't known for accuracy, but he got this right. You've got yourself a woman and child, Whitfield." Jackson closed the door, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Winters and her daughter are staying until spring." Martha snorted. That's what they all say. She turned to Abigail. How you feeling, girl? You look better than I expected, given what they're saying in town. Abigail blinked, taken aback by the woman's directness. I'm well. Thank you, Mrs. Colson. What? What are they saying? Oh, the usual nonsense. That you bewitched Marcus Powell, that the baby isn't his, that you're living in sin with the territory's most mysterious widower. Martha waved a hand dismissively. People need something to talk about during winter. You two are this year's entertainment. Abigail flushed, but Martha was already moving on, peering into the cradle. Pretty little thing. What's her name? Lily, Abigail replied. Good name. Strong, but feminine. Martha straightened, turning her attention back to Jackson. You going to offer me coffee, Whitfield? Or have you forgotten basic hospitality out here in the wilderness? To Abigail's surprise, Jackson almost smiled. Coffee's hot, Mrs. Colson. Cups are clean. Well, that's something at least. She settled herself at the table like she owned it. Don't suppose you have anything stronger. Jackson retrieved a bottle from a high shelf and set it beside her coffee cup. Martha nodded approvingly and added a generous splash to her drink. Now then, she said, taking a sip. I came for more than delivering pie. News travels even in snow. Judge Powell's been making inquiries about you, Whitfield, sending telegrams back east. Jackson's face remained impassive, but Abigail saw his shoulders tense slightly. What kind of inquiries? He asked, his voice carefully controlled. The kind that suggest he's looking for leverage. Martha's eyes narrowed. He's not a man who likes being defied, and you taking in Miss Winters and her child accounts as defiance in his book. Abigail looked between them, sensing undercurrents she didn't fully understand. Mrs. Colson, how do you know Mr. Whitfield? Martha's gaze shifted to Abigail, assessing. We haven't been formally introduced until now, but I know of him. Everyone around here does, even if they pretend otherwise. The quiet rancher who keeps to himself, speaks when spoken to, pays his bills on time. She smiled slightly. A man with perfect manners and a past nobody talks about. Mrs. Colson, Jackson warned, his voice low. Martha held up a hand. Don't worry. I'm not here to spill your secrets. Lord knows we've all got those. She turned back to Abigail. I was married 36 years. Loved that man till the day he died, even if he did snore like a freight train and forget my birthday every year of our marriage. Abigail wasn't sure how to respond to this non sequitur. I'm sorry for your loss. My point is, Martha continued, ignoring Abigail's confusion. A good man's not always the one who talks the most. Sometimes he's just the one who stays when you need him. She gave Jackson a significant look. And sometimes the people who shout loudest about propriety and morality are the ones with the most to hide. She finished her coffee in one long swallow, then stood. Pie should be eaten warm, and you'd best keep that rifle loaded, Whitfield. Spring thaw brings all sorts out of hibernation, both the four-legged kind and the two-legged. With that cryptic warning, she wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders and moved to the door. Jackson opened it for her, and she paused on the threshold. Pretty work, she said, nodding toward Lily's cradle. Better than what we had for our Jacob. Then she was gone, disappearing into the gathering dusk, like she'd never been there at all. Jackson closed the door behind her, turning the latch with deliberate care. When he finally looked at Abigail, his expression was unreadable. Who was that? She asked, still trying to make sense of the whirlwind visit. Martha Colson, widow, ranch about 3 miles east. He moved to the stove, pouring himself coffee with a hand that wasn't quite steady. Her husband died 2 winters ago, pneumonia. She seems to know you better than you know her. Jackson sighed, sitting heavily in his chair. Small territory, people talk. About your past, Abigail pressed gently. About who you were before you came here. The silence stretched between them, waited with unasked questions. Abigail thought he might refuse to answer, retreat behind the wall of privacy he'd maintained since her arrival. But something in Martha's visit seemed to have unsettled him, cracked the careful facade he presented to the world. I wasn't always Jackson Whitfield, he finally said, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it. But that man who I was before, he died a long time ago. Abigail's heart quickened. This was the closest he'd come to acknowledging what she'd discovered in the newspaper clipping. Because of the fire, she asked softly. Because of Sarah and Rebecca. His eyes snapped to hers, sharp with sudden suspicion. What do you know about that? Abigail hesitated, then decided truth was the only path forward. I found a newspaper article under the floorboard near the hearth about Dr. Samuel Whitfield losing his family in a fire during the war at Shiloh. Jackson's face went blank, a shudder falling over whatever emotion had been there a moment before. He rose, moved to the mantel, and took down the wooden box he'd guarded so carefully. For a long moment, he simply held it, his broad hands cradling it like something alive and fragile. I told you, my family died 7 years ago, he said finally. That was a lie. What? Abigail asked. Why change when it happened? Why change your name? Jackson opened the box, removing something that glinted in the firelight, a gold wedding band. Because Samuel Whitfield couldn't live with what happened, with what he'd done, or rather what he hadn't done. He turned the ring over in his palm, his face illuminated by the dancing flames, shadows deepening the lines around his eyes and mouth. I was an army surgeon with the Union forces. The Battle of Shiloh was a slaughter. Thousands of wounded. I worked for 3 days straight, barely stopping to eat or drink. Men dying under my hands faster than I could save them. His voice had taken on a distant quality, as if he were seeing not the cabin walls, but the blood-soaked field hospital of his memories. Sarah had followed me, bringing Rebecca. They were staying in a small house in Cairo, close enough that I could visit when duty allowed. The night of the 3rd day, a messenger came. There'd been a fire. By the time I reached them, he closed his hand around the ring knuckles, whitening. If I'd been there, if I hadn't been so determined to save everyone else. You can't know that, Abigail said gently. Fires happen so quickly. I could have gotten them out. I know I could have. The certainty in his voice was absolute, unyielding. Instead, I buried what was left of them and kept working. There were still wounded who needed care. The dead would have to wait. He replaced the ring in the box, closing it with finality. After the war, I couldn't go back to medicine. Couldn't bear the thought of failing someone else that way. So Samuel Whitfield died alongside his family and Jackson was born. And the 7 years, why change the timing? He shrugged, a small, helpless gesture at odds with his usual composure. 14 years seemed impossible. Too long to still feel it the way I do. 7 was more believable. Abigail absorbed this understanding, washing through her. The man before her had been broken by loss, and guilt had remade himself in isolation, carrying his grief like a stone in his chest for 14 years. And yet, he had still stopped on a snowy night to save a woman and child who reminded him of what he'd lost. Thank you, she said, for telling me the truth. Jackson returned the box to the mantel, his back to her. You deserve to know who you're sharing a roof with. Abigail rose, setting Lily in her cradle before moving to stand beside him at the fire. It doesn't change anything. Who you were then, who you are now, you're still the man who saved us." He turned to face her, and in the firelight, his eyes held a vulnerability she'd never seen before. "I couldn't save them, but I could save you." The simple truth of it hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Abigail felt tears prick behind her eyes, not for herself, but for this man who had carried such a weight for so long. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand on his cheek. His skin was warm and rough with stubble, and he went very still at her touch, like a wild animal unused to gentleness. "Samuel Jackson, whoever you are," she said softly, "I'm glad it was you who found us in the snow." For a breathless moment they stood that way, connected by her touch, and the understanding that flowed between them. Then slowly Jackson raised his hand to cover hers, his calloused fingers enfolding her smaller ones with exquisite care. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even a promise. But in that quiet gesture was the acknowledgement that something had changed between them, something neither was ready to name, but both could feel delicate and new as the first shoots of spring beneath the melting snow. March brought rain, turning the world from white to brown to gradually green. The days lengthened, and with them came a sense of renewal that touched everything, the land, the animals, and the small household that had formed in Jackson's cabin. Abigail's shooting lessons continued, her aim improving until she could hit targets at surprising distances. Jackson proved to be a patient teacher, correcting her stance with gentle adjustments, his hands brief and professional on her shoulders or arms. But sometimes in the moment after she'd made a particularly good shot, she would turn to find him watching her with an expression that made her heart quicken, pride mingled with something warmer, something that lingered after he'd looked away. They spoke no more about his past, but the revelation had changed things between them. Jackson seemed lighter somehow, as if sharing even that small part of his burden had eased the weight he carried. He spoke more freely occasionally, even laughed a rusty sound as if long unused but genuine. One mild afternoon, as Abigail hung laundry on a line strung between two pines, she watched Jackson work in what would soon be a garden. He turned the soil methodically, his movements economical and sure, Lily settled in a sling across his chest. The baby had dozed off, lulled by the rhythm of his labor and the warmth of the spring sun. The sight made something twist in Abigail's chest, a sweet ache, half joy and half fear. Joy at the simple beauty of the moment, fear at how easily she could imagine many such moments stretching into a future she had no right to claim. Spring meant leaving. She had promised as much, and Jackson had never suggested otherwise. Soon, the roads would be clear enough for travel, and she would need to decide where to go, how to make a life for herself and Lily, without imposing any further on Jackson's solitude. Yet with each passing day, the thought of leaving grew more painful. This cabin had become more of a home to her than any place she'd known since leaving the orphanage. And Jackson had become something she had no name for. Not quite a friend, certainly not a lover, but essential somehow. A presence she had grown accustomed to, a voice she listened for, a solidity in a world that had proven all too unstable. "You're staring," he called, not looking up from his work. Abigail flushed, caught. "Just making sure you're not teaching my daughter bad habits," she replied, trying for lightness. "Your technique with that shovel is questionable at best." He straightened one hand, supporting Lily's back, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Is that so? And you're an expert on soil preparation, Miss Boston. I'll have you know I maintain the finest kitchen garden at St. Mary's," she said with mock indignation. "Sister Agnes said my radishes were divinely inspired." "Radishes, huh?" He glanced down at the sleeping infant against his chest. Hear that, Lily? Your mother's a gardening prodigy. We'd best pay attention. The casual way he included both of them in his statement, the easy familiarity of it, made Abigail's heart constrict again. This was dangerous territory, this comfortable domesticity, this sense of belonging. It couldn't last, shouldn't last. She had been fooled once by promises of home and family. She couldn't risk such disappointment again. And yet, "What will you plant?" she asked, pinning the last of the washing to the line. "Basics. Potatoes, beans, carrots." He returned to his digging. "Maybe some of those divinely inspired radishes, if you're willing to share your expertise." "I suppose I could be persuaded," Abigail said, moving closer to the turned earth. "Though my fee is steep, 1 smile from Miss Lily per radish." "Highway robbery," Jackson muttered, but the warmth in his eyes belied his gruff tone. Abigail knelt beside the freshly turned soil, running her fingers through the dark earth. It was good soil, rich with possibility. Seeds planted here would thrive given proper care. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, not looking at him, "about what comes next. For Lily and me." Jackson's digging slowed. "Spring's nearly here. Roads will be clear soon." "Yes." She kept her eyes on the dirt, tracing patterns with her fingertip. "I could go to Helena, perhaps, find work as a seamstress or in a shop." He was silent for so long that she finally looked up. His face had returned to its usual impassive mask, but there was a tension around his eyes she hadn't seen in weeks. "That would be sensible," he said finally. "Helena's growing. Opportunities there." "Yes," Abigail agreed, though her heart sank at his matter-of-fact response. What had she expected? That he would ask them to stay, that he would confess he couldn't bear to see them go. Lily stirred in her sling, making the small mewling sounds that preceded full wakefulness. Jackson automatically began to rock slightly from side to side, a motion Abigail had seen him use countless times to soothe the baby. "Of course," she continued, struggling to keep her voice even. "There's no rush. The garden will need tending, and I wouldn't want to leave you with all the work after you've been so kind." "No rush," he echoed, his eyes meeting hers briefly before returning to the soil. "Plenty of time to decide." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even a promise. But in those few words was the acknowledgement that the door wasn't closed, that possibilities remained, possibilities neither was ready to name, but both could feel delicate and new as the seeds they would soon plant in the waiting earth. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, carried by a reluctant postman who clearly would have preferred to leave it at the end of the lane rather than approach the cabin directly. Jackson met him at the gate, accepting the envelope with a nod that sent the man scurrying back to his horse. Abigail watched from the doorway, Lily balanced on her hip. In the 2 months she'd been at the ranch, no mail had come. No visitors, except Martha Colson, who had returned twice more with pies and cryptic warnings about Judge Powell's continued interest in Jackson's past. "What is it?" she asked, as Jackson studied the envelope, his expression darkening. "Letter from town. Official seal." He handed it to her. "Town Council." Abigail shifted Lily to free a hand, taking the envelope with a sense of foreboding. It was addressed to Mr. Jackson Whitfield and Miss Abigail Winters, the handwriting neat and formal. She broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet inside. "They want us to appear before the council," she said, scanning the brief message, "next Tuesday, regarding matters of community concern and moral standards. It's signed by Judge Powell." Jackson's jaw tightened. "I expected this." "Expected what?" Abigail looked up from the letter concern, sharpening her voice. "What does he want? to make an example. Jackson took the letter back, reading it more carefully. He's had 2 months to stew about you refusing his son, about me taking you in. Now he's making his move. But what can he do? We haven't broken any laws. Laws are flexible things in places like Dust Creek, Jackson said grimly. And public opinion is a powerful weapon. He'll use it to force you either back to his son or out of the territory entirely. Fear coiled in Abigail's stomach. He can't do that. He can't just exile people. He can make life impossible. Ensure no one will rent to you, hire you, sell to you. Jackson's expression was hard-knowing. I've seen it before. Small towns, big grudges. The nail that sticks up gets hammered down. Lily squirmed in Abigail's arms, sensing her mother's distress. Abigail bounced her gently, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. "What do we do?" she asked, hating the tremor in her voice. Jackson was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant, calculating. Finally, he said, "We go. We face them. Running would only confirm whatever accusations they're preparing. And then we come home." The simplicity of his statement, the certainty of it, steadied her. This cabin, this small patch of earth, it was home now to both of them. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Jackson took the letter to his desk, setting it beside the journal, where he still wrote to Sarah each night, a habit he'd continued even after revealing the truth to Abigail. But now, instead of writing in secret after she was asleep, he often did so, while she sewed or read by the fire, their silence comfortable and shared. Martha was right, he said more to himself than to Abigail. Spring brings things out of hibernation, including old grudges. "Do you think—" Abigail hesitated, then pressed on. "Do you think he knows about who you really are?" Jackson turned to face her, his expression grave. "I think he's been digging, and if he's persistent enough, he'll find something. The question is whether he already has, or if this is just the first move in a longer game." The thought of Judge Powell uncovering Jackson's past, using it against him, made Abigail's protective instincts flare. "We could leave. Before Tuesday. Go to Helena or Bozeman. Somewhere he doesn't have influence." Jackson shook his head. "Running won't solve anything. And I'm tired of running." He looked around the cabin at the life he'd built, piece by piece. "This is my home. I won't be driven from it by fear." His resolve should have reassured her, but Abigail couldn't shake the sense of approaching danger. She'd seen the coldness in Judge Powell's eyes, the calculated cruelty in Mrs. Powell's dismissal. These were people accustomed to power, to having their way. They wouldn't easily accept defiance. "What if they try to take Lily?" she asked, giving voice to her deepest fear. "What if they claim I'm unfit, that Marcus should have custody?" Jackson's expression hardened. "They won't take her. I promise you that." The fierceness in his tone sent a shiver through Abigail, not of fear, but of something more complex. This man who had lost his own child, who had rebuilt a life from the ashes of tragedy, was promising to protect hers with the same determination he would have shown for his own flesh and blood. "Thank you," she said softly, the words inadequate for the depth of her gratitude. Jackson nodded once, then returned to the desk, pulling out a fresh sheet of paper. "I'm writing to a friend," he explained, "a lawyer in Helena. He owes me a favor. If Powell is planning what I think he is, we'll need legal counsel." Abigail watched him write, his handwriting neat and precise, the hand of an educated man, a doctor. Samuel Whitfield hadn't disappeared entirely, she realized. He was there in Jackson's careful movements, his knowledge of medicine, his unexpected moments of eloquence. The two men weren't as separate as Jackson believed, and perhaps that was why Judge Powell's interest was so dangerous. He wasn't just threatening a reclusive rancher who had taken in a fallen woman. He was threatening to expose the fracture at the heart of Jackson's carefully constructed life, the division between who he had been and who he had become. Outside, clouds gathered on the horizon, promising more spring rain. Inside, Abigail held Lily close and prayed that the storm brewing in Dust Creek would pass them by, leaving their fragile happiness intact. But deep down, she knew better. The calm they had found together was just that, a calm between storms. And the thunder was already rolling in the distance. The day before their summons to town, a visitor arrived at the ranch, one far less welcome than Martha Colson had been. Marcus Powell rode up on a gleaming bay horse, his attire impeccable. Despite the muddy roads, his handsome face set in lines of practiced contrition. Jackson spotted him from the sheep pen and intercepted him before he could reach the cabin where Abigail was inside with Lily. "Mr. Powell," Jackson greeted him, his voice neutral, but his stance blocking the path to the door. "What brings you out this way?" Marcus removed his hat, revealing hair carefully styled despite the wind. "Mr. Whitfield, I've come to speak with Miss Winters, a private matter." "Nothing's private out here," Jackson replied. "Say your piece." Marcus's smile tightened. "I'd prefer to speak with Abigail directly. And I'd prefer you state your business and be on your way." The two men regarded each other, the tension between them palpable. Marcus was younger, his face unlined by hardship, but there was a calculation in his eyes that belied his boyish appearance. Jackson stood solid as an oak, weathered but unyielding. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if Abigail hadn't emerged from the cabin drawn by the sound of voices. She froze when she saw Marcus, her face draining of color. "Abigail," Marcus said, his tone softening to something honeyed and familiar. "You look well, recovered from your ordeal." "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steadier than Jackson would have expected. Marcus took a step toward her, but Jackson didn't move aside. The younger man shot him an irritated glance before focusing again on Abigail. "I've come to apologize," he said. "My behavior was unworthy. I panicked when faced with the responsibility of fatherhood, but I've had time to reflect, to mature." He managed to look appropriately chastened. "I'm ready to do right by you and the child, to give you my name, my protection." Abigail stared at him, incredulity gradually replacing shock. "You're proposing now, after abandoning me at the altar, after your mother threw me into a snowstorm with a newborn." "I know it seems sudden," Marcus acknowledged, "but tomorrow's council meeting, it could be difficult for you, for both of you." His gaze flicked to Jackson, then back to Abigail. "My father is determined to address what he sees as a moral lapse in our community. But if we were to announce our engagement, if you were to come back to town with me today, the whole matter could be resolved without any unpleasantness." The calculation behind the offer was so transparent that Jackson had to suppress a snort of disgust. But it was Abigail's reaction that truly surprised him. She laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh or even an amused one. It was the laugh of someone who had seen through a deception so completely that it became absurd. "Your father put you up to this," she said when she had composed herself. "He sent you out here to fetch me back to save face for the Powell family before he makes whatever accusations he's planning tomorrow." Marcus's expression hardened. "It's a legitimate offer, Abigail. More than most women in your position could hope for." "My position?" Abigail echoed. "And what position is that exactly? A woman who chose her child over the approval of people like you, who found more kindness and honor in a stranger, than in the man who claimed to love her. She stepped forward, her posture straight and proud. "I'm not going anywhere with you, Marcus. And tomorrow, when your father tries to shame me for choosing my own path, I'll hold my head high, knowing I made the right choice." Marcus's face flushed with anger. "You're making a mistake. My father—" "Your father is using you just as he always has," Abigail interrupted. "And you're letting him just as you always have. Go home, Marcus. There's nothing for you here." For a moment, Marcus looked as if he might argue further. Then his gaze shifted to Jackson, who had watched the exchange in silence, his hand never far from the knife at his belt. Something in Jackson's steady gaze must have warned him against pressing the issue. "This isn't over," Marcus said, jamming his hat back on his head. "Tomorrow, you'll wish you'd taken my offer." He mounted his horse with unnecessary force, wheeling it around and spurring it into a gallop that sent mud spraying from its hooves. They watched him go in silence, his figure growing smaller against the greening hills until he disappeared from view. Only then did Abigail's composure falter. She let out a shaky breath, wrapping her arms around herself as if suddenly cold. "You handled him well," Jackson said quietly. She gave him a wan smile. "I've had 2 months to think about what I would say if I ever saw him again. The real thing was actually easier than I imagined. He seems smaller somehow, less significant." "Men like Marcus Powell are always smaller than they appear," Jackson observed. "They puff themselves up with their family names, their borrowed importance." Abigail looked in the direction Marcus had disappeared. "What do you think his father is planning?" "For tomorrow," Jackson sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Something public, something designed to make an example of us." He glanced at the cabin where Lily would be waking from her nap soon. But Marcus's visit suggests they're not as confident as they'd like to be. They wanted to avoid the confrontation if possible. Why, what are they afraid of? Unpredictability, public opinion turning against them. The Powells rule through a combination of wealth and the appearance of moral authority. If that authority is questioned— "But we're just 2 people," Abigail said. "How much of a threat could we possibly be?" Jackson's expression was grim. "It's not about us. It's about what we represent. Defiance. Independence. Choosing a different path than the one they prescribed." He looked at her with unexpected gentleness. "You're stronger than they anticipated, Abigail. That makes you dangerous." His words warmed her even as the situation chilled her to the bone. She had never thought of herself as strong, not when she was an unwanted orphan, not when she fell for Marcus's false promises, not when she found herself abandoned and desperate. But standing here now, having faced down the man who had once seemed to hold her future in his hands, she felt something like strength stirring within her. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, "we face it together." Jackson nodded his eyes, holding hers with a steadiness that calmed the last of her trembling. Together. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even a promise. But in that single word was the acknowledgement that whatever came next, they would meet it not as 2 broken individuals, but as something new and stronger, a unit forged in winter's crucible, tempered by shared hardship and quiet joy, ready to weather whatever storm awaited them in Dust Creek. Dust Creek had grown since Jackson's last visit. New storefronts lined the main street, and the church where he had found Abigail now had a fresh coat of white paint gleaming in the spring sunshine. Progress had come to this corner of Montana territory, bringing with it an air of permanence that had been lacking when he first arrived 7 years ago. They rode into town on Jackson's 2 horses, Abigail perched somewhat uncertainly on the gentler mare, Lily secured to her chest in a sling Jackson had fashioned from an old blanket. They had dressed in their best clothing, Jackson in a clean shirt, and his one good jacket, Abigail, in a dress she had remade from one of Jackson's late wife's garments, found in a trunk in the barn. The blue calico suited her, bringing out the color of her eyes and the auburn highlights in her hair. People stopped to stare as they passed, conversations halting mid-sentence. Jackson kept his gaze forward, his back straight, but he was acutely aware of the whispers that followed in their wake. Abigail, too, held her head high, though he could see the tension in the set of her shoulders. The town hall stood at the end of the main street, a two-story building with a small bell tower and double doors that opened onto a wide porch. A crowd had already gathered, more people than should have been interested in a routine council meeting. News traveled fast in small communities, and the prospect of public drama had drawn onlookers like flies to honey. Jackson dismounted first, then helped Abigail down, his hands steady at her waist. She gave him a grateful smile, adjusting Lily in her sling. "Quite the audience," she murmured, eyeing the crowd. "They're not all against us," Jackson replied quietly. "Remember that. Powell has influence, but he's made enemies too. Some will be here hoping to see him taken down a peg." As if to confirm his words, a figure detached itself from the crowd, Martha Colson, resplendent in a purple dress that had probably been fashionable a decade ago. "Well, you two certainly know how to draw a crowd," she greeted them, her eyes twinkling with mischief despite the gravity of the situation. Half the territories turned out to see Judge Powell's latest attempt at playing God. "Mrs. Colson," Jackson acknowledged with a nod, "kind of you to come." "Wouldn't miss it for all the gold in Helena," she replied. "Besides, someone needs to stand with you, and most folks around here have more caution than courage." She glanced at Abigail. "You ready for this, girl? It won't be pleasant." Abigail straightened, one hand protective over Lily. "I'm ready." Martha nodded approvingly. "Good. Now, let me see that baby properly." As Martha cooed over Lily, Jackson scanned the crowd, noting familiar faces: the blacksmith who shoed his horses, the general store owner who filled his infrequent orders, the schoolteacher who had arrived last fall. Some avoided his gaze, others nodded slightly in greeting. Not enemies, perhaps, but not allies either. Cautious neutrality was the best they could hope for from most. The town hall doors opened, and a hush fell over the gathered spectators. A man in a somber suit emerged, the town clerk, his expression suitably grave for the proceedings. "The council will see Mr. Whitfield and Miss Winters now," he announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent street. Jackson placed a hand at the small of Abigail's back, a gesture of support that did not go unnoticed by the watching crowd. Together, they climbed the steps, Martha following close behind. Inside, the town hall's main chamber had been arranged like a courtroom. A long table faced rows of benches with 5 men seated behind it, the town council with Judge Harold Powell at the center. His silver hair and black judge's robe lent him an air of authority that the other councilmen in their plain suits couldn't match. To one side sat Marcus, looking uncomfortable but determined. Beside him was his mother, Eleanor Powell, her face set in lines of righteous disapproval. Jackson and Abigail took their places at a small table facing the council. Martha settled directly behind them, her presence a bulwark against the hostile stares from the crowded benches. Judge Powell gavelled the meeting to order, his deep voice resonating in the high-ceilinged room. "This special session of the Dust Creek Town Council is convened to address matters of community concern," he intoned, "specifically the living arrangement between Mr. Jackson Whitfield and Miss Abigail Winters, which has been brought to our attention as potentially detrimental to the moral fabric of our growing community." A murmur ran through the spectators. Jackson remained impassive, his eyes fixed on Powell. Beside him, Abigail sat perfectly straight, her hand gentle on Lily's back. Miss Winters, Powell continued, you arrived in our community last December ostensibly to marry my son Marcus Powell. Is this correct? Abigail's voice was clear and steady. Yes, Your Honor. I came at Marcus's invitation with the understanding that we would be married immediately. And yet the marriage did not take place. No, Your Honor. Your son did not appear for the ceremony. A few whispers arose from the crowd. Powell frowned slightly. My son has explained that there were extenuating circumstances, concerns about your mental stability, and the paternity of your child. Abigail didn't flinch. There were no such concerns until the day of our wedding, when your son abandoned me and your wife ejected me from the church. More whispers louder now. Powell rapped his gavel. We are not here to retry those events, he said sharply. The fact remains that following this unfortunate misunderstanding you took up residence with Mr. Whitfield, a man to whom you are not married, in a remote location without benefit of chaperone or proper supervision. This arrangement has caused considerable concern among the respectable citizens of Dust Creek. Jackson leaned forward. Miss Winters was suffering from childbed fever when I found her. Moving her would have meant death for her and the child. As the nearest neighbor to the church, I provided emergency shelter. Nothing more. For 3 months, Powell's eyebrow arched skeptically. Winter has been over for some time, Mr. Whitfield. Yet this arrangement continues. The roads have only recently become passable, Jackson pointed out, and Miss Winters has been recovering her strength. I saw no need to rush her departure when she was safe and well cared for. Safe, well cared for? Eleanor Powell's voice cut through the chamber, though she hadn't been invited to speak. A young woman living alone with a man who is not her husband, with her illegitimate child, you call that safe? Judge Powell didn't silence his wife. Jackson noted. This interruption had been planned. My daughter is not illegitimate, Abigail said, her voice still controlled but vibrating with intensity. Her father simply chose not to acknowledge her. There's a difference. Eleanor Powell sniffed. Semantics. The fact remains that you are living in sin with Mr. Whitfield setting an example that threatens to undermine the very values this community was founded upon. Mrs. Powell. Jackson said, his patience wearing thin, I have provided Miss Winters and her child with shelter, nothing more. Can you swear to that before God and this assembly? Judge Powell asked, leaning forward. Can you swear that your relationship with Miss Winters has remained entirely proper? The implied accusation hung in the air. Jackson felt Abigail stiffen beside him. Our relationship is not the business of this council or this community, Jackson replied evenly. But since you insist on making it so, I will state plainly, I have treated Miss Winters with nothing but respect. She has her own bed. I have mine. We share a roof, nothing more. It was the truth, but even as he said it, Jackson was aware of how inadequate it was to describe what had grown between them over the winter months. They hadn't shared a bed, hadn't shared more than the most fleeting of touches, but they had shared something perhaps more intimate: grief, recovery, quiet mornings and fire-lit evenings, the care of a child, the building of a life. Judge Powell seemed disappointed by his answer, as if he'd hoped for a more damning admission. He shuffled some papers before him, then looked up with renewed purpose. Mr. Whitfield, your reputation in this community has always been ambiguous. You keep to yourself, participate minimally in civic affairs, maintain few social connections. Until now, this eccentricity has been tolerated. But recent information has come to light that casts your character in a more concerning light. Jackson felt a coldness settle in his stomach. This was it, the moment he'd been dreading since Martha's warning about Powell's inquiries. "Would you care to tell this assembly your real name?" Powell asked, his eyes sharp with triumph. A hush fell over the room. Jackson was aware of Abigail's gaze on him, of Martha shifting forward in her seat, of the collective intake of breath from the spectators. "My name is Jackson Whitfield," he said, his voice steady. "It's the name I've used for 7 years in this territory. It's the name on my land deed, my bank account, my business dealings." "But it is not the name you were born with, is it?" Powell pressed. "Not the name you used when you served as an army surgeon during the war between the states. Not the name of the man who abandoned his post at a critical moment, resulting in the deaths of soldiers under his care." The accusation struck like a physical blow. Jackson heard Abigail's small gasp beside him, felt Martha's hand come to rest supportively on his shoulder. "That is a lie," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I never abandoned my post." Powell smiled thinly. "Perhaps not in the most literal sense. But I have here," he held up a telegram, "testimony from your commanding officer, Colonel James Harding, stating that you left the field hospital at Shiloh during the height of the battle despite direct orders to remain. That when you returned, men had died who might have been saved by your presence." Jackson's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. "I received word that my wife and child were in danger. I went to them. When I returned, I worked for 48 hours straight, without rest. After your family had already perished," Powell said, his voice heavy with false sympathy. "A tragedy, to be sure, but one that might have been averted had you remained at your post, fulfilling your duty." Rage surged through Jackson, hot and unfamiliar, after years of emotional numbness. "You dare to speak of my family, of my duty, you who have never known loss, never faced the choice between sworn obligation and the lives of those you love." Powell's expression hardened. "I dare to speak of a man who has deceived this community about his identity, his past, and now harbors a young woman in circumstances that can only be described as scandalous. A man who, by his own admission, placed personal concerns above his sworn duty, a pattern that appears to be repeating itself in his current entanglement." "This is absurd," Abigail interjected, her cheeks flushed with anger. "Mr. Whitfield saved my life and my child's when no one else would help. He has been nothing but honorable and kind. Whatever name he chooses to use, whatever happened during the war, has no bearing on the man he is today. The council will determine what is relevant, Miss Winters," Powell said coldly. "And speaking of relevance, let us return to the matter at hand. Your living situation with Mr. Whitfield, or should I say Dr. Whitfield, is inappropriate and must end immediately." He turned to his son. "Marcus has generously offered to overlook past indiscretions and make you his wife, providing a name and home for your child. Alternatively, arrangements can be made for you to return east to a facility where women in your situation can receive appropriate care and guidance." The veiled threat was clear: marry Marcus, or be institutionalized. Jackson felt Abigail trembling beside him, though whether from fear or rage he couldn't tell. "And if I refuse both options?" she asked, her voice remarkably steady. Powell's smile was cold. "Then the council will have no choice but to declare you an unfit mother, placing your child in the care of those better suited to provide a moral upbringing." The room erupted in murmurs. Jackson half rose from his seat, only Abigail's restraining hand on his arm preventing him from lunging across the table at Powell. "You have no legal authority to take her child," Martha Colson declared, standing up behind them. This isn't a court of law, Harold, and you know it. It's just you and your cronies playing at justice." Powell glared at her. "Mrs. Colson, you are out of order. This council has been duly elected to oversee the moral and civic welfare of Dust Creek. Elected to fill potholes and settle disputes over fence lines," Martha shot back. "Not to tear families apart based on your personal grudges." "Family," Powell scoffed. "What family? A fallen woman, her bastard child, and a man living under a false name? That's not a family. It's a scandal." "It's more of a family than you've ever had," Martha retorted. "For all your fine house and respectable name, I've never seen love in it. Just ambition and appearances." Powell's face darkened. "One more outburst, Mrs. Colson, and you will be removed from these proceedings." Before Martha could respond, the doors at the back of the hall burst open. A man entered, tall, distinguished, in an expensive suit that marked him as a visitor to Dust Creek. He strode down the center aisle with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "I believe this might be an appropriate time for me to introduce myself," he announced, his voice carrying easily through the now silent hall. "Thomas Blackwood, attorney at law, representing Mr. Whitfield and Miss Winters." Jackson felt a surge of relief. His letter had reached Helena in time. Judge Powell was less pleased. "This is a town council meeting, Mr. Blackwood, not a court proceeding. Legal representation is unnecessary and unwelcome." "On the contrary," Blackwood replied smoothly, setting his briefcase on the table beside Jackson. "When a governing body threatens to separate a mother from her child based on unsubstantiated moral accusations, legal representation becomes not merely appropriate, but essential." He opened his briefcase, removing a stack of papers. "I have here affidavits from respected citizens of Helena testifying to Mr. Whitfield's character and standing. I also have documentation regarding the legal status of Miss Winters' residence at Mr. Whitfield's ranch, which I believe you'll find is entirely within the bounds of propriety." Powell's face had grown increasingly red as Blackwood spoke. What documentation could possibly justify their living arrangement? Blackwood smiled a predatory expression that suggested he had been waiting for precisely this question. "A contract of employment," he said, placing a document on the table. "Miss Winters has been legally employed as Mr. Whitfield's housekeeper since January, with room and board provided as part of her compensation. A common and accepted arrangement throughout the territory, as I'm sure the council is aware." The murmurs in the room grew louder. Powell's grip on his gavel tightened visibly. "This contract is dated today," he said, after examining the document. "A transparent attempt to legitimize an improper situation after the fact." "The verbal agreement has been in place since January," Blackwood countered. "The written contract merely formalizes existing terms." He turned to address the broader council and the spectators beyond. "Gentlemen, ladies, what we have here is a case of personal vendetta, masquerading as moral concern. Judge Powell, upset that Miss Winters rejected his son's belated proposal, seeks to punish her, and by extension, the man who offered her shelter when the Powell family cast her out." "That is an outrageous accusation," Powell sputtered. "Is it?" Blackwood raised an eyebrow. "Then perhaps you'd care to explain why you've spent considerable resources investigating Mr. Whitfield's past. Why you've mischaracterized his service record, omitting the commendation he received for saving more lives at Shiloh than any other surgeon present. Why you've presented this council with a selective and distorted version of events designed to serve your personal agenda." The room had grown so quiet that Lily's soft coos were audible. Jackson stared at Blackwood, surprised by the vehemence of his defense. The lawyer caught his eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod. A promise kept, a debt repaid. Judge Powell attempted to regain control. Mr. Blackwood, these insinuations are supported by evidence, Blackwood interrupted, placing another document before the council. This is a sworn statement from Colonel James Harding, the same man you quoted selectively in your telegram. His full testimony paints a rather different picture of Dr. Whitfield's conduct during and after the tragedy that claimed his family. Jackson felt something shift inside him, a loosening of a knot that had been tied around his heart for 14 years. Colonel Harding had not condemned him, had not blamed him for the deaths that had occurred during his absence. The realization was almost too much to bear. Abigail's hand found his beneath the table, her fingers intertwining with his in silent support. He held on as if she were a lifeline in a stormy sea. Powell was still speaking, still trying to reassert his authority, but the momentum had shifted. The other council members were exchanging uncertain glances, clearly reluctant to continue down a path that might lead to legal complications. Finally, one of them, the oldest, a merchant named Wilkins, cleared his throat. Judge Powell, perhaps we should adjourn to consider this new information. It seems there are complexities we hadn't fully appreciated. Powell looked as if he might argue, but a quick survey of his fellow councilmen showed him outnumbered. With ill grace, he rapped his gavel. This meeting is adjourned pending further review. No action will be taken at this time regarding the situation at the Whitfield Ranch. It wasn't a victory, not exactly, but it was a reprieve. Jackson rose, still holding Abigail's hand, and turned to face the crowded room. The spectators were already beginning to disperse, some looking disappointed that the expected drama had been cut short, others thoughtful, reassessing the couple before them. Marcus Powell pushed past his face a mask of thwarted rage. Eleanor Powell followed, pausing only to deliver a withering glare before sweeping out in her son's wake. "Well," Martha said, coming to stand beside them, "that was more entertaining than I expected. You make powerful enemies, Whitfield, but apparently you make powerful friends, too." She nodded approvingly at Blackwood, who was returning papers to his briefcase. "An old debt," Jackson explained briefly. "From the war." "Must have been some debt," Martha observed. "Legal help like that doesn't come cheap." Blackwood approached, extending his hand to Jackson. "Dr. Whitfield, it's been a long time." Jackson accepted the handshake. "Too long. Thank you for coming, Thomas." "As I told Martha, an old debt," Blackwood replied with a smile. "Though I'd have come anyway after reading Powell's telegram. The man's vendetta was transparent." "Will he try again?" Abigail asked, adjusting Lily in her sling. Blackwood considered her, his expression softening. "Possibly. Men like Powell don't surrender easily, but he'll be more cautious now, knowing you have legal representation. And public opinion seems to be shifting." He glanced around the hall where small groups still lingered discussing the proceedings. "People don't like to see a mother threatened with separation from her child, especially when she has committed no crime." "So what happens now?" Jackson asked. "Now," Blackwood said, "you go home. Live your lives. Be the family Powell accused you of pretending to be. The best defense against gossip is a life well lived in plain sight." Family. The word echoed in Jackson's mind, both familiar and strange. He had been so long without one that he had almost forgotten what it meant, the daily rhythms of shared meals and quiet evenings, the knowledge that someone would notice if you didn't come home, the feeling of being known, truly known by another person. And yet, wasn't that what he and Abigail had built over the winter months? A family not of blood, but of choice, founded on mutual respect and growing affection, with Lily at its center. As they left the town hall, stepping into the bright spring sunshine, Jackson felt something he hadn't experienced in 14 years, a sense of possibility of a future not defined by loss, but by what might yet be gained. Beside him walked Abigail, her head high, Lily secure against her chest. Behind them came Martha and Blackwood, still discussing the finer points of the confrontation. They made an odd procession down Dust Creek's main street. The reclusive rancher, with a hidden past, the unwed mother, with her infant daughter, the outspoken widow, and the distinguished lawyer. Not a conventional family by any measure. But as they reached their horses and prepared for the journey home, Jackson realized he wouldn't have it any other way. The life he had built from the ashes of tragedy had led him here to this moment, to these people. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he was grateful for the path that had brought him to them. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even a promise. But as he helped Abigail mount her horse, their eyes met with a shared understanding that transcended words. Whatever came next, they would face it together, not as two broken individuals, but as something new and stronger, a family forged in winter's crucible, and emerging at last into spring's tentative light. The journey home from Dust Creek was quiet, each rider lost in their own thoughts. Thomas Blackwood had returned to Helena with promises to remain vigilant regarding Judge Powell's intentions. Martha had ridden with them part of the way before turning off toward her own ranch, leaving Jackson and Abigail to complete the final miles alone. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the greening hills, painting the landscape in soft gold. Wildflowers had begun to appear in patches, purple lupine yellow arrowleaf balsam root, and the delicate white blossoms of wild strawberries. Spring had truly arrived in Montana territory, bringing with it renewal and possibility. As they crested the final ridge overlooking Jackson's ranch, Abigail reined her horse to a stop, gazing down at the small cabin, the barn, the garden plot freshly turned for planting. From this vantage point, it looked both humble and perfect. A haven carved from wilderness, a place where broken things could mend. "Home," she said softly, testing the word. Jackson halted beside her, his eyes following hers. "For as long as you want it to be." The simple statement hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. No longer was it a matter of staying until spring, until the roads cleared, until Abigail was strong enough to travel. Now it was a choice, her choice, whether to make this place a temporary shelter or something more permanent. Lily stirred in her sling, making the small sounds that signaled hunger. Abigail adjusted her position, soothing the baby with gentle pats. "She's tired," Jackson observed. "Been a long day for one so small." "For all of us," Abigail agreed. She glanced at him, noting the new lines of weariness around his eyes, the tension still visible in the set of his shoulders. "Are you all right? What Powell said about the war, about your commanding officer?" Jackson's gaze remained on the cabin below. "I've carried that weight for 14 years. The belief that I'd failed in my duty, that men died because I wasn't there. To learn that Harding never blamed me." He shook his head, as if still unable to fully process this revelation. "It doesn't erase what happened, but it lightens it somehow." "You deserve to know the truth," Abigail said. "All these years punishing yourself for a judgment that was never passed." "Not all judgments come from others," Jackson replied. "The harshest ones are often our own." Abigail understood this all too well. How many times had she condemned herself for trusting Marcus, for believing his promises, for bringing Lily into a world that had initially rejected them both? Yet the past months had taught her that such self-judgment served no purpose except to keep old wounds from healing. "Perhaps it's time we both stopped being our own harshest judges," she suggested. Jackson looked at her, then really looked at her, his blue eyes searching hers, as if seeking something vital. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, for he nodded once decisively. "Perhaps it is," he agreed. Then, with a slight tilt of his head toward the cabin, "Let's go home." They rode down the slope together side by side, the word home echoing between them like a promise neither was quite ready to name, but both had begun to believe might be possible. Life at the ranch settled into a new rhythm in the days following their confrontation with Judge Powell. The temporary reprieve granted by the council allowed them to return to the business of daily living, but with a subtle shift in perspective. What had been a temporary arrangement now carried the weight of choice, of deliberate decision, rather than mere necessity. Jackson threw himself into spring planting, turning more soil for the garden than he'd initially planned. Abigail noticed him measuring twice, digging irrigation channels, building a low fence to keep rabbits out, all signs of investment in a future harvest they would share. For her part, Abigail began to think of the cabin not as Jackson's home where she was staying, but as their shared space. She moved her few possessions from the corners where she had kept them neatly contained to more permanent places. The dress she had remade from Sarah's old clothing no longer felt borrowed but transformed, made her own through the work of her hands. They still maintained their separate sleeping arrangements, Jackson on his narrow cot near the stove, Abigail in the bed, but the invisible boundaries within the cabin had softened. They moved around each other with increasing ease, anticipating needs, sharing tasks without discussion. One evening, as April drew to a close, Abigail was nursing Lily by the fire when Jackson returned from the barn carrying a large wooden object wrapped in an old blanket. "Made something," he said, setting it carefully on the floor. "For Lily." Curious Abigail watched as he unwrapped the blanket to reveal a cradle, not the makeshift crate he had initially provided, but a proper cradle crafted from polished pine, with gently curved rockers, and a headboard carved with delicate leaf patterns. "Oh, Jackson," she breathed, reaching out to touch the smooth wood. "It's beautiful!" He ducked his head slightly, unused to praise. "She's outgrowing the crate. Needed something proper." Abigail ran her fingers over the headboard, finding Lily's name carved there in flowing script. The craftsmanship was exquisite, revealing a patience and attention to detail that spoke volumes about the man who had made it. "When did you find time for this?" she asked. "Evenings, after you were asleep." He shrugged as if it were a small thing and not a gift that made her heart constrict with emotion. "Wanted it to be a surprise." "It is." Abigail blinked back unexpected tears. "The most wonderful surprise." Jackson looked pleased, though he tried to hide it. "We can put it by your bed. She'll sleep better there than in that crate." "She will." Abigail finished nursing Lily, then carefully laid her in the new cradle, tucking a small blanket around her. The baby settled immediately, as if recognizing she was exactly where she belonged. "She knows it's from you. It's from... See how peaceful she is." Jackson watched Lily with an expression Abigail had come to recognize, a mixture of wonder and old sorrow, joy in the child before him, and grief for the one he had lost. He reached down to touch the baby's cheek with one calloused finger. "Sleep well, little one," he murmured. The tenderness in his voice and his touch made Abigail's throat tighten. This man who had lost so much, who had every reason to harden his heart against further attachment, had opened himself to loving her daughter, and in doing so had begun to heal wounds she hadn't fully realized he carried. When he straightened, their eyes met over the cradle. Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of the bonds forming among the three of them, ties that went beyond gratitude or convenience to something deeper and more lasting. Abigail found herself reaching for his hand. Jackson hesitated only briefly before taking it, his larger fingers enfolding hers with gentle strength. They stood that way for a long moment, connected by touch and shared care for the sleeping child between them, neither speaking nor needing to. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even a promise. But in the quiet of that evening, with Lily sleeping peacefully in the cradle Jackson had made with his own hands. Something shifted between them, a step forward on a path neither had expected to travel, but both now recognized as the one they were meant to follow. May arrived with a burst of wildflowers and the constant song of meadowlarks. The garden flourished under their combined care rows of vegetables pushing green shoots through the dark soil. Lambs frolicked in the sheep pen, their bleating a cheerful counterpoint to the deeper calls of their mothers. On a particularly fine morning, Jackson surprised Abigail by suggesting they ride to the creek that marked the eastern boundary of his property. Water's high with the melt, but there's a spot where it pools quiet. Good place for a meal away from chores. Abigail gladly accepted. The past weeks had been full of work, garden planting, spring cleaning, the myriad tasks that came with the change of seasons. A few hours of leisure sounded like heaven. They set out mid-morning, Lily secured in her sling against Jackson's chest. He had taken to carrying her this way often, claiming it left Abigail's hands free for other tasks, but she suspected he simply enjoyed the baby's closeness. Lily, for her part, seemed equally content in his care, babbling happily as they rode through meadows dotted with spring flowers. The creek, when they reached it, justified Jackson's praise. It tumbled down from the hills clear and cold, but at a bend in its course, it widened and slowed, forming a deep pool bordered by willows and cottonwoods just beginning to leaf out. The ground nearby was carpeted with grass and wildflowers, creating a natural place to spread the blanket Jackson had brought. They ate a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried apples, taking turns holding Lily, who was determined to grab at everything within reach. The sun was warm, the breeze gentle, carrying the scent of pine and new growth. For a little while they could pretend there was no Judge Powell, no town council, no complications beyond deciding which wildflower Lily should examine next. After they ate, Jackson stretched out on the blanket hat, pulled low over his eyes, apparently content to doze in the spring sunshine. Abigail sat beside him, Lily in her lap, watching the play of light on the water, and thinking how different her life had become in just a few months. Had anyone told her at Christmas that she would find happiness on a small Montana ranch with a taciturn widower and her newborn daughter, she would have thought them mad. Yet, here she was, more at peace than she had ever been at the orphanage or during her brief time with Marcus. "Penny for your thoughts," Jackson said, startling her from her reverie. She hadn't realized he was awake. "I was just thinking how unexpected life can be," she replied, "how the things we think we want aren't always what we need." He pushed his hat back, squinting up at her against the sun. "And what is it you need, Abigail Winters?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. Jackson wasn't one for personal inquiries, preferring to let people reveal themselves in their own time. That he would ask now, in this unguarded moment, suggested a shift in their relationship she wasn't sure she was ready to define. "Safety," she answered finally. "A place where Lily can grow up knowing she's loved. Work that has meaning." She paused, then added softly, "People who see me as I am, not as they wish me to be." Jackson nodded as if her answer confirmed something he'd already suspected. "And have you found those things here?" "I think I might have," she admitted, "though I didn't expect to." He sat up, then, his face close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his beard, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes. "What did you expect when I came to Montana? A husband, respectability, security." She smiled wryly. "All the things Marcus promised, but never intended to provide." "And now—" Abigail looked down at Lily, who had fallen asleep in her lap, one small hand curled around her mother's finger. Now I've learned that respectability isn't the same as worth, that security can come in unexpected forms, that some promises, even unspoken ones, mean more than vows made before a congregation. She met his gaze again, finding it steady and intent. "What about you, Jackson? What is it you need?" He was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost as if he were talking to himself. "For years, I would have said nothing, that I'd had what I needed and lost it, and nothing could fill that space again." He looked out over the creek, his profile strong against the blue sky. But that wasn't living. It was just existing, waiting for a death that took its time in coming. Abigail's heart ached for him, for the years of solitude he had endured, punishing himself for choices no one else condemned. "And now?" she echoed his earlier question. His eyes returned to hers, direct and clear. "Now I find myself wanting things I'd given up on. Peace that comes from sharing silence, not just enduring it. Purpose beyond mere survival." His gaze dropped to Lily, softening. The chance to see her grow, to be part of that journey. To build something lasting not just for myself, but for others. The careful way he phrased it, avoiding direct mention of her of them as a unit, told Abigail he was being cautious, unwilling to presume or pressure. Yet the meaning was clear enough. "I think," she said carefully, "that those are things worth wanting." Jackson nodded once, the movement containing both acknowledgement and restraint. He wasn't pushing, wasn't asking for commitments she might not be ready to make, simply laying the foundation for what might come later, when they were both more certain. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility. Then Lily stirred and whimpered, breaking the tension. Jackson smiled, reaching out to stroke the baby's head with gentle fingers. "Someone's ready to head back, I think." The ride home was companionable, the silence between them comfortable rather than weighted. Nothing had been decided, no declarations made, but something had shifted a step forward in the slow dance they had been engaged in since winter. As they approached the cabin, the afternoon sun gilding its rough boards with warm light, Abigail found herself thinking of Jackson's words, "To build something lasting not just for myself, but for others." It was, she realized, what she wanted too. Not the false security Marcus had promised, built on lies and appearances, but something real and enduring, constructed day by day from shared work, mutual respect, and growing affection. Whether that building would take place here on this small ranch with this quiet man remained to be seen. But for the first time since discovering Marcus's betrayal, Abigail allowed herself to hope for a future that included more than just survival, one that held the possibility of true happiness. The letter arrived a week later, carried once again by a reluctant postman. This time, however, it bore no official seal, just Abigail's name written in a flowing, feminine hand. Jackson brought it in from the gate, his expression guarded. "For you," he said, handing it to her. "From town, looks like." Abigail took the envelope, turning it over curiously. She had received no correspondence since arriving in Montana, having no family to write to, and few acquaintances beyond the walls of St. Mary's. Who would be writing to me? She wondered aloud. Jackson shrugged, though the tension in his shoulders suggested he was less nonchalant than he appeared. Only one way to find out. Abigail broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The paper was expensive, the handwriting elegant and practiced. She read silently, her expression shifting from curiosity to confusion to disbelief. "What is it?" Jackson asked, watching her closely. "It's from Eleanor Powell," Abigail said, her voice faint with surprise. She wants to meet with me. Privately, tomorrow at the church. Jackson's face darkened. After what happened at the council meeting, it's a trap. I don't think so, Abigail replied, still scanning the letter. She says she has information about my past, about my parents. She looked up at him, bewildered. How could she possibly know anything about that? Jackson took the letter when she offered it, reading with a deepening frown. It's vague. Could be a ruse to get you away from the ranch, away from protection. Or it could be genuine, Abigail countered. She mentions details that I was left at St. Mary's as an infant, that I have a handkerchief with initials. Things Marcus couldn't have told her because I never showed him the handkerchief. Jackson set the letter on the table, his expression troubled. Even if she does know something, why tell you now? The Powells aren't known for their charitable impulses. Abigail had been wondering the same thing. She says she's been having dreams about a woman named Sarah. She met Jackson's startled gaze. You're Sarah. She says the dreams won't stop until she tells me what she knows. That's convenient, Jackson said, though he looked unsettled. Using my wife's name to ensure you'd be interested. But how would she know about Sarah? Abigail pressed. You've lived as Jackson Whitfield all these years. Your connection to Samuel and Sarah Whitfield wasn't public knowledge until the council meeting, and even then the details weren't discussed. Jackson had no answer for this, his face reflecting the same confusion Abigail felt. Finally, he sighed. You want to go? It wasn't a question, but Abigail nodded anyway. I have to. If there's any chance she knows something about my parents, about where I came from. I've wondered my whole life, Jackson. I can't turn away from this opportunity, however strange it seems. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once decisively. Then we'll go together. Tomorrow. Relief washed through her. She hadn't wanted to go alone, but neither had she wanted to ask Jackson to accompany her, knowing how he avoided town and its reminders of recent confrontations. Thank you, she said simply. He picked up the letter again, reading it with narrowed eyes. Noon at the church. Public enough to be safe, private enough for conversation. He glanced at her. Bring the handkerchief. If she really knows something about your past, she'll recognize it. Abigail agreed, though a small voice in the back of her mind whispered caution. Eleanor Powell had been cruel to her once before, driving her into a snowstorm that nearly claimed 2 lives. What had changed to make the woman reach out now, offering information Abigail had sought her entire life? And what connection could the elegant, cold-eyed wife of a territorial judge possibly have to an orphan from Boston and a handkerchief embroidered with the initials SW? The church looked different in spring sunshine than it had in winter's grip. White paint gleamed on its clappered sides, purple lilacs bloomed beside the steps, where Abigail had once collapsed in desperation, and birds sang from the newly leafed trees in the small cemetery beside it. Jackson helped Abigail down from her horse, his movements gentle, but his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. He had insisted on wearing his pistol, though he normally left it at home for trips to town. Abigail had Lily secured in her sling, the baby contentedly gumming a wooden rattle Jackson had carved for her. I don't see anyone, Abigail said, glancing around the churchyard. It was empty, save for themselves, the appointed hour of noon still a few minutes away. We're early, Jackson replied. Deliberately. He nodded toward the church doors. Let's wait inside. Better position if this is some kind of ambush. Abigail thought he was being overly cautious, but she didn't argue. Jackson's protective instincts had kept them all safe through a Montana winter. She wouldn't dismiss them now. The church interior was cool and dim after the bright sunshine outside. Dust motes danced in the colored light, filtering through simple stained glass windows. The pews were empty, the altar bare, save for a white cloth and a single vase of lilacs. Jackson positioned them in a pew near the back, with a clear view of both the main doors and the small side entrance near the altar. His hand stayed close to his pistol, his posture alert despite his outward calm. They didn't have to wait long. 5 minutes past noon, the side door opened, and Eleanor Powell entered alone. She wore a somber gray dress, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun, her bearing as regal as ever. But there was something different about her face, a tension around the eyes, a weariness that hadn't been present during the council meeting. She spotted them immediately, her gaze lingering on Lily before moving to Jackson with a flash of surprise. "I had hoped to speak with Miss Winters alone," she said by way of greeting. "That wasn't specified in your letter," Jackson replied evenly, "and given recent events, you'll understand if we're cautious about private meetings." Eleanor's mouth tightened momentarily, but she nodded. "Very well. I suppose it's fitting that you're here too, Dr. Whitfield." The use of his real title wasn't lost on either of them. Jackson's eyes narrowed slightly. "You seem to know a great deal about matters most people would consider private, Mrs. Powell." "More than I wished to," she agreed cryptically. She moved to sit in the pew across the aisle from them, arranging her skirts with practiced precision. "But we're not here to discuss you, Doctor. At least, not directly." She turned her attention to Abigail, her expression difficult to read. "You brought the handkerchief." Abigail nodded, reaching into her pocket to withdraw the small square of linen. She held it up so Eleanor could see the embroidered SW in the corner. The older woman's face paled slightly, but she showed no surprise. "May I?" she asked, extending her hand. Abigail hesitated, then passed the handkerchief across the aisle. It was the only link to her past, the only possession she had, that might have belonged to her birth parents. Letting it out of her possession, even momentarily, felt like surrendering a piece of herself. Eleanor examined it carefully, turning it over in hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. "I recognize the stitching," she said finally. "My younger sister Clara had a distinctive way of forming her letters. I taught her myself when our mother was too ill to do so." Abigail felt Jackson go very still beside her. "Your sister," he repeated, his voice carefully neutral. Eleanor nodded, returning the handkerchief to Abigail with visible reluctance. "Clara was impetuous, romantic. She eloped at 17 with a medical student, a man our father considered far beneath her in station. He disowned her, forbade any of us from contacting her." A shadow passed over her face. "I obeyed as I was taught to do. It was the last time I saw her alive." Abigail's heart had begun to beat faster, a strange suspicion forming in her mind. This medical student, what was his name? Eleanor met her gaze directly. Samuel Whitfield. The name hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Abigail felt, rather than saw, Jackson's sharp intake of breath. "That's impossible," he said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "Sarah was from Illinois, a farmer's daughter. We met when I was in medical school in Chicago. Sarah was the name Clara took when she left home," Eleanor explained, her composure cracking slightly. "To make a clean break from her past," she said. "Our father was a powerful man with connections throughout the Northeast. She feared he would find her, force her to return home." "You're saying—" Abigail could barely form the words, the possibility too enormous to grasp. "You're saying that Sarah Clara was your sister, and that she was married to Dr. Samuel Whitfield?" Eleanor nodded, her eyes never leaving Abigail's face. "Yes, and they had a daughter born in Boston after Samuel joined the Union Army. A daughter who was reported to have died in a fire along with her mother in 1862. Jackson shook his head, denial written in every line of his body. "My wife and daughter did die in that fire. I buried them." "You buried someone," Eleanor corrected gently. "But not your wife. Not your daughter." Her gaze shifted to Lily, then back to Abigail. "The resemblance is striking. When I saw you at the church that day in your wedding dress with your baby, something about you seemed familiar. But it wasn't until the council meeting, when your connection to Dr. Whitfield was revealed, that the pieces began to fall into place." "You expect us to believe this," Jackson's voice had dropped to a dangerous register, "that my wife somehow survived a fire, that I was told claimed her life, that she what abandoned our daughter at an orphanage, that Abigail is—" He couldn't finish the sentence, the implication too painful, too hopeful. "I expect you to listen," Eleanor said, a flash of her usual imperiousness returning, "to a story I should have investigated years ago had I not been too proud, too obedient to my father's dictates." She folded her hands in her lap, gathering herself. "After Clara Sarah eloped, I received exactly 3 letters from her. The first to tell me she was happy married to a man she adored. The second, to announce she was with child. The third, written in haste, to inform me that Samuel had joined the army as a surgeon, and she was following him to be near the front, despite being in the late stages of her pregnancy." Her voice grew softer, tinged with old regret. "I burned all 3, as my father would have expected. But I remembered, and when the news came of her death in a fire, I grieved privately, telling no one of my connection to the young army surgeon's wife." "But she didn't die," Abigail prompted when Eleanor fell silent. "No." Eleanor met her gaze again. "2 years ago, when my husband's business took us to Boston, I visited an old family friend, a doctor who had once courted me before I married Harold. During our conversation, he mentioned treating a woman years earlier, shortly after the Battle of Shiloh. She had been brought to him badly burned, with no memory of who she was or how she had been injured. All she had with her was a baby girl, miraculously unharmed." Jackson leaned forward, and his knuckles white where he gripped the pew in front of them. "And this woman, you believe it was Sarah, my Sarah?" "I believe it was Clara, yes." Eleanor's certainty was unwavering. "The doctor described her as having unusual eyes, one blue, one green, a trait that ran in our family for generations. Sarah's eyes were like that," Jackson admitted, his voice barely audible. "I used to tell her they were like looking at the boundary between sky and sea." Eleanor nodded, as if this confirmation was expected. "The doctor said she lived only long enough to give him the baby's name, Abigail, and to ask that the child be kept safe. He had no way of knowing who the woman was or where she had come from. When no one came looking for the child, he arranged for her placement at St. Mary's." "But someone did come looking," Jackson said, a terrible understanding dawning on his face. "I went to Cairo as soon as I could get leave. They showed me bodies burned beyond recognition, said it was my wife and daughter. I believed them. I never thought," his voice broke, "I never thought to look elsewhere." "Because you had no reason to," Eleanor said with unexpected gentleness. "By all accounts, they had died in that fire. Only by the strangest of chances, a burned woman appearing in Boston, with a child the same age your daughter would have been, did the truth survive at all." Abigail's mind was reeling, trying to process the implications of what she was hearing. If Eleanor was right, if this incredible story was true, then she wasn't an unwanted child abandoned on an orphanage doorstep. She was Rebecca Abigail Whitfield, daughter of Samuel and Sarah Whitfield. "A new beginning for both of you," Jackson agreed, "though perhaps it's more of a homecoming than a beginning." 2 weeks later, they rode into town together, not with trepidation as before, but with purpose. Thomas Blackwood had prepared the adoption papers, and Judge Porter, a fair-minded man who had never gotten along with Judge Powell, presided over the brief ceremony at the courthouse. Martha Colson stood as witness, beaming with satisfaction. Word of their story had spread through Dust Creek, transformed in the telling from scandal to something closer to legend. The doctor who lost his family only to unknowingly rescue his own daughter years later. The tale had softened hearts and changed minds. As they walked down the main street afterward, they received nods of acknowledgement, even a few congratulatory handshakes. Eleanor Powell had come alone without her husband or son, dressed in a subdued blue that better suited her than her usual severe grays. She embraced Abigail briefly, formally, but with genuine feeling. "Clara would be proud," she whispered. Even Judge Powell seemed to have accepted defeat, retreating to focus on more conventional matters of law. Marcus had left for Helena, rumors said, seeking his fortune away from his father's influence. Abigail nodded, understanding what Jackson meant about homecomings. In finding her father and learning the truth of her origins, she had not so much started a new chapter as returned to a story interrupted long ago, a story of family and belonging that had been waiting all these years to be continued. Daughter of the man sitting beside her, who had found her in the snow without knowing who she was, who had saved her and her child out of simple human decency. "The handkerchief," she said, suddenly remembering the small square of linen in her pocket. "How did I come to have it, if what you're saying is true?" Clara Sarah had a set of them embroidered with her new initials, a wedding gift from me, sent in secret after she eloped. Eleanor's composure slipped further, a sheen of tears visible in her eyes. The doctor said she had one clutched in her hand when they found her. It was placed with the baby's few possessions when she was taken to the orphanage. Jackson stood abruptly, moving to the window, as if he needed air, needed space to absorb this revelation. His back was to them, his shoulders rigid with tension. Abigail looked down at Lily, sleeping peacefully against her chest, unaware of the seismic shift occurring in the adult's understanding of their shared history. If Eleanor was right, this tiny girl wasn't just Abigail's daughter, she was Jackson's granddaughter. The thought was too enormous, too life-altering to fully comprehend. "Why tell us now?" Jackson asked, without turning his voice controlled, but with an undercurrent of raw emotion. "After all these years, why come forward with this story?" Eleanor sighed, smoothing her skirts in a gesture that seemed more nervous than fastidious. "I told myself it was too late, that too much time had passed, that opening old wounds would serve no purpose. And then the dreams began. Dreams of Sarah." Abigail remembered from the letter. "Yes, night after night for weeks now. Always the same. Clara Sarah standing in flames, holding a baby, pointing toward the church." Eleanor's voice wavered slightly. "I'm not a fanciful woman, Dr. Whitfield. I don't believe in ghosts or visitations. But these dreams, they felt like a reckoning, a demand for truth that I could no longer ignore." Jackson turned back to face them, his expression carefully composed, but his eyes revealing the storm within. "You have proof of this, beyond dreams and coincidences." Eleanor reached into a small reticule she carried, withdrawing a folded paper. "I wrote to the doctor in Boston after the dreams began. This is his reply confirming what he told me 2 years ago. The dates align with when Clara would have given birth when the fire in Cairo occurred. And then there's the handkerchief with my sister's distinctive stitching." She paused. "And there's you, Miss Winters, the age you would be if you were Rebecca, with Clara's auburn hair and Samuel's green eyes." Abigail touched her hair self-consciously, having never considered it might be an inheritance rather than a coincidence. But why would Sarah Clara have been in Boston? The fire was in Cairo. That I don't know, Eleanor admitted. Perhaps she was fleeing something or someone. Perhaps she had family connections there I was unaware of. The doctor's letter mentions she was incoherent from pain for most of the short time she lived, able to communicate only her concern for her child. A heavy silence fell over the church. Outside, birds continued their spring songs, unaware of the revelations unfolding within. Lily stirred and whimpered, perhaps sensing the tension in her mother's body. Jackson moved back to the pew, sitting beside Abigail again, his presence solid and reassuring despite his own obvious turmoil. "We would need more than this to be certain," he said, but his tone had softened, the absolute denial replaced by cautious consideration. "Of course," Eleanor agreed. "I've taken the liberty of writing to the orphanage requesting any records they might have of Abigail's arrival, and I have asked the doctor to send any personal effects that might have been recovered with Clara items that you, Dr. Whitfield, might recognize as belonging to your wife." Abigail looked at her in surprise. "You've gone to considerable trouble for people you tried to drive from town just weeks ago." A flash of something shame perhaps crossed Eleanor's aristocratic features. "I behaved poorly, both at your wedding and at the council meeting. I allowed my husband's ambitions and my own pride to overshadow what should have been simple human decency." She met Abigail's gaze directly. "I cannot change what I did, but I can attempt to right a wrong that has persisted for far too long." The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. Whatever Eleanor Powell's faults, and they were many in this moment, she was not the cold, judgmental woman who had cast Abigail into the snow, but someone seeking atonement for a deeper, older sin. "What happens now?" Abigail asked, looking between Eleanor and Jackson. "If what you're saying is true, if I am Rebecca." She couldn't quite bring herself to say "your daughter" to Jackson, the concept still too overwhelming to articulate. "That's for you to decide," Eleanor said. "I've delivered the truth as I understand it. What you do with it is your choice." Jackson had been silent, his gaze distant, as if seeing not the church interior, but some point in the past, or perhaps the future. Now he stirred, focusing on Eleanor with new intensity. "Does your husband know about this? About your connection to Sarah, to Abigail?" Eleanor shook her head. "Harold knows nothing of my estranged sister or her marriage. He married me for my family's political connections, not my personal history." A hint of bitterness colored her tone. "His vendetta against you both is purely about wounded pride. His son rejected his authority challenged." "Then this stays between us," Jackson decided. "Until we have more proof, until we're certain, there's no need to involve Powell or anyone else in town." Eleanor nodded agreement. "I'll forward any correspondence I receive from Boston. And She hesitated, then continued with visible effort. "I would like the opportunity to make amends. To know my niece, if that's what you prove to be. And her child, my grandniece." The request was tentative, almost humble, a stark contrast to the imperious woman who had presided over the council meeting. Abigail found herself unexpectedly moved by the vulnerability beneath Eleanor's carefully maintained facade. "If what you've told us is true," she said slowly, "then we are family. And Lily should know all of her family, not just parts of it." She glanced at Jackson, including him in this provisional acceptance. "But we'll need time to process this, to adjust." "Of course." Eleanor rose, gathering her reticule with hands that were steadier now. "I've said what I came to say. The rest must unfold in its own time." She moved toward the side door, then paused, looking back at them. "For what it's worth, I believe Clara would be pleased To know that her husband and daughter found each other even in such unlikely circumstances. With that she was gone, the door closing softly behind her. Abigail and Jackson remained in the pew, the silence between them heavy with unasked questions, unspoken thoughts. Finally Jackson turned to her, his face more open, more vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "Abigail, Rebecca." "Abigail," she said gently, "it's the only name I've ever known, the one I've answered to all my life." He nodded, accepting this. "Abigail, then. I don't know if what she told us is true. It seems impossible. A coincidence too great to believe." "But you want to believe it," she observed. "Yes?" He admitted the simple word containing volumes of suppressed hope, of cautious joy. "God help me, I do." Abigail understood. The possibility that she might be his daughter, lost and found again after so many years. It was like something from a fairy tale too perfect to be real. And yet, "The handkerchief," she said. "Your wife's eyes, the timing of it all. It fits, Jackson." "It fits," he agreed. "But we need more. More proof, more time to understand what this means for both of us." Lily chose that moment to wake fully, her small face scrunching up in preparation for a hungry wail. Abigail adjusted her position, soothing the baby with practiced motions. Jackson watched them, his expression softening. "Whatever the truth turns out to be," he said quietly, "nothing changes about the present, about your place at the ranch, about Lily." His eyes met hers, steady and sure. "About us." The simplicity of his statement, the certainty in it, steadied Abigail's racing thoughts. He was right. Whether she was Rebecca Whitfield or just Abigail Winters, orphan from Boston, didn't change the bonds they had formed over the past months. Didn't erase the trust, the respect, the growing affection that had transformed two broken people into something stronger, more whole. "No," she agreed, finding a smile despite the tumult of emotions. "Nothing changes about that." They left the church together, stepping out into the spring sunshine with the weight of revelation upon them. But as they mounted their horses for the journey home, Abigail found herself looking not to the past that Eleanor's story had opened up, but to the future stretching before them, a future that, regardless of what proof might come from Boston, would be faced together. The weeks that followed Eleanor Powell's revelation passed in a strange limbo of waiting and wondering. True to her word, she forwarded correspondence from Boston first, a letter from the doctor confirming his story, then documents from St. Mary's regarding a foundling left in their care in May of 1862, and finally, most compelling of all, a small package containing items recovered from the burned woman's possessions. Among them was a locket tarnished silver, its original design almost obliterated by heat damage. But when Jackson prized it open with trembling hands, the tiny portrait inside was still visible. A young woman with one blue eye and one green, her smile serene, her hair the same auburn shade as Abigail's. "Sarah, Sarah," Jackson whispered, his voice breaking on the name. "My Sarah." Abigail watched as he cradled the locket, this tangible proof of the story Eleanor had told. The woman in the portrait was a stranger to her, yet also incredibly her mother. The knowledge settled inside her not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual acceptance of a truth that felt increasingly undeniable. She was Rebecca Abigail Whitfield, daughter of Samuel and Sarah Whitfield, daughter of the man who had saved her from the snow without knowing who she was. The irony of it, that she had spent her life in an orphanage while her father lived on, believing her dead, was almost too much to bear. All those years of loneliness, of wondering why she had been abandoned, when in fact she had been loved, had been mourned, had been sought in the wrong place, at the wrong time. Jackson, too, seemed overwhelmed by the implications, by the joy mingled with grief for all the years lost. He moved through the days with a new awareness of Abigail watching her in quiet moments, as if trying to reconcile the woman before him with the infant daughter he had believed dead for so long. They spoke of it obliquely in fragments, neither quite ready to fully embrace the changed nature of their relationship. To acknowledge Abigail as Jackson's daughter was to reimagine their entire connection, to reframe the growing closeness between them not as potential romance, but as the reunion of family long separated. Yet even as they adjusted to this new understanding, life at the ranch continued its steady rhythm. The garden flourished, sheep were sheared, repairs were made to fences and roof. Lily grew stronger and more alert each day, her personality emerging in gummy smiles and determined attempts to crawl. And through it all, a quiet certainty took root between them, that whatever their blood connection might be, the bond forged in that winter cabin was real and enduring. Father and daughter, or simply two souls who had found each other at the precise moment of greatest need, they belonged together with Lily, completing their unconventional family. It was Eleanor, surprisingly, who helped them find their way forward. Her initial tentative request to know her niece evolved into regular visits to the ranch, bringing not only news from town, but also stories of the sister she had loved and lost. Through these stories, Sarah Clara emerged not as a saint or a martyr, but as a real woman, stubborn, passionate, determined to chart her own course despite the constraints of her time and station. "You have her spirit," Eleanor told Abigail one afternoon as they sat on the porch watching Jackson teach Lily to pet Ranger's rough fur. "The same unwillingness to accept the life others prescribe for you." Abigail smiled, touched by the comparison. "Is that why you disliked me so on sight? Because I reminded you of her?" Eleanor considered this, her aristocratic features softening in thought. "Perhaps, or perhaps I saw in you the choices I never had the courage to make myself." She glanced at Abigail. "I married as I was told to marry, lived as I was told to live. Only in these recent months, with these dreams, these revelations, have I begun to question whether obedience was worth the price it exacted." From anyone else, such introspection would have seemed natural. From the proud, proper Eleanor Powell, it was nothing short of revolutionary. "It's never too late to change course," Abigail suggested gently. Eleanor's smile held a hint of her old irony. "Perhaps not, but it is considerably more difficult at my age with my history." She looked out over the ranch, her gaze thoughtful. "Still seeing you here with your child, making a life on your own terms, it gives one pause." Their conversation was interrupted by Jackson's approach, Lily babbling happily in his arms. The baby had taken to him, completely reaching for him whenever he entered a room, falling asleep contentedly against his broad chest. Whatever biological connection might exist between them, their bond was undeniable. "Someone wants her mother," Jackson said, transferring Lily to Abigail's waiting arms. His hand lingered briefly on Abigail's shoulder, a touch so natural neither of them remarked on it. Eleanor observed this casual intimacy with sharp eyes. Later, as she prepared to leave, she drew Jackson aside for a moment of private conversation. Abigail couldn't hear what was said, but when they returned, both wore expressions of quiet resolution. That evening, after Lily had been settled in her cradle, Jackson joined Abigail on the porch. The spring twilight was mild stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. For a time they sat in companionable silence, watching as fireflies began their nightly dance over the meadow. "Eleanor said something to me today." Jackson finally began, his voice thoughtful. "Something that made me realize we've been avoiding the conversation we need to have." Abigail nodded, having sensed the same. About whether I'm truly Rebecca. About what that means for Ayas. Yes. He turned slightly to face her, his expression earnest in the fading light. I believe you are my daughter. Everything points to it. The handkerchief, the locket, the timing, even the way you hold your head when you're thinking just like Sarah did. Abigail felt tears prick behind her eyes, unexpected emotion welling up at this simple, heartfelt declaration of belief. I think so too, she admitted. It explains so much, why I never felt I belonged at St. Mary's, why I was so desperate to find a family of my own, why I trusted Marcus so readily, despite all evidence I shouldn't. Jackson's hand found hers warm and steady. If you are Rebecca, and I believe with all my heart that you are, then I've been given a miracle I never thought possible. A second chance to be a father to the child I thought I'd lost forever. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. But that's not all we are to each other, Abigail. These past months watching you rebuild your life after betrayal, seeing your strength and kindness, your devotion to Lily, I've come to care for you in a way that has nothing to do with biology and everything to do with who you are as a woman. Abigail felt a flutter of something complex in her chest, not quite disappointment, not quite relief, but a shifting of emotional ground beneath her feet. And I care for you, she said softly, for your quiet strength, your integrity, the way you've opened your life to us, without hesitation or condition. So we find ourselves in an unusual position, Jackson continued. Bound by blood, but also by something that in different circumstances might have grown into more. The delicacy with which he approached the subject touched her. He wasn't presuming, wasn't assuming, merely acknowledging a possibility that had existed between them before Eleanor's revelation. Eleanor suggested something, he said after a moment. A path forward that honors both realities. What did she suggest? Abigail asked, curious about what counsel the older woman might have offered. That I legally adopt you, Jackson said. Acknowledge you as my daughter, in the eyes of the law make official what we now believe to be true. His eyes held hers warm with affection. It would give Lily a grandfather, give you a father, give us both the family we thought we'd lost forever. Abigail felt tears spill over, trailing warm down her cheeks. You would do that. Make it official. With pride. He assured her, his own voice rough with emotion. Nothing would honor me more than to claim you as my daughter Abigail. To tell the world that you are mine, in every way that matters. The simplicity of it, the rightness settled into Abigail's heart, like a key turning in a lock. This was the answer they had been circling, not a dramatic redefinition of their relationship, but a formal acknowledgement of the truth. They had discovered a foundation upon which they could build their future together. Yes, she said, squeezing his hand. I would like that very much. Jackson's smile in the gathering darkness was like sunrise after a long night. Then it's settled. I'll speak to Blackwood about drawing up the papers. He hesitated, then added gently, We can keep your name as Abigail if you prefer. You've lived with it all your life, but legally you would be a Whitfield. Abigail Whitfield. She tested the name, finding it felt right on her tongue. And Lily would be Lily Whitfield. A new beginning for both of you, Jackson agreed. Though perhaps it's more of a homecoming than a beginning. Abigail nodded, understanding what he meant. In finding her father and learning the truth of her origins, she had not so much started a new chapter as returned to a story interrupted long ago, a story of family and belonging that had been waiting all these years to be continued. As if sensing the emotional significance of the moment, A soft breeze stirred the new leaves of the cottonwoods, carrying with it the scent of earth and growing things. From inside the cabin came Lily's sleepy murmur, the sound traveling clearly through the open window. "We should go in," Abigail said, rising. "It's getting cool." Jackson stood with her, but before they turned toward the door, he drew her into a gentle embrace, the first they had shared since learning of their connection. It was the hug of a father finding his child of a man, reclaiming a piece of his heart, long thought lost. Abigail returned it, letting herself feel perhaps for the first time the security of being someone's daughter, of being wanted, cherished, claimed. They entered the cabin together, father and daughter, returning to the home they had built from shared grief and unexpected joy. Outside, the first stars of evening shone down on the small ranch where snow had once threatened 2 lives, but where now in its place flowers bloomed in abundance, wild and beautiful, and surprisingly resilient, much like the family that had taken root there against all odds. It wasn't the ending Abigail had imagined when she arrived in Montana with dreams of marriage and respectability. It was something far better, far truer, a belonging based not on social convention or legal contract, but on the deepest connections of the human heart. 1 year later, the garden flourished in summer abundance, rows of vegetables stretching green and lush under the Montana sun. Abigail moved between them, basket on her arm, selecting ripe tomatoes for the evening meal. From the porch came peals of laughter, Lily, now 18 months old, toddling on sturdy legs as she chased a butterfly, her dark curls bouncing with each determined step. Jackson sat nearby, whittling a small wooden horse, his eyes never straying far from his granddaughter. "Easy there, little one," he called as Lily veered precariously close to the steps. "Those butterflies are tricky creatures." Lily turned at the sound of his voice, her face lighting with recognition and joy. "Papa," she called her name for him, not quite Grandpa, but something uniquely their own. She abandoned the butterfly chase and ran to him with the reckless confidence of a child who knows she will always be caught if she falls. Jackson set aside his carving and swept her up his weathered face, transformed by a smile that erased years of solitude and grief. "That's right, I'm your papa," he agreed, settling her on his knee. "And who's that in the garden?" "Mama," Lily crowed, waving toward Abigail, who smiled and waved back. Eleanor Powell's carriage appeared on the horizon, a regular Sunday visitor now. Martha would arrive later with one of her famous pies. The cabin had grown too small for their expanding circle, and a new room was under construction, Jackson and the blacksmith's son working on it each evening. As Abigail walked back toward the porch basket full, she paused to admire a patch of wildflowers growing where snow had once nearly claimed their lives. Their vibrant colors against the weathered cabin walls seemed to embody their journey beauty, emerging from hardship life, reclaiming what winter had buried. "Look, Lily," she said, pointing to a particularly lovely blue blossom. "Flowers from the snow." Lily studied the flowers solemnly, then broke into a wide grin that mirrored her grandfather's. In that shared smile, Abigail saw the future unfurling before them, seasons changing, Lily growing, their family strengthening with each passing day. They had found at last the home they had each sought their entire lives, a place where even the deepest snows of winter inevitably gave way to flowers.